Hello, I think I might be live. I did actually just start the stream and I was talking for a good 7 minutes for myself, I think. It'd be really helpful if people could confirm that I am live. Anyway, assuming that I am, we're going to watch Question Time in just a bit. This is a socialist stream, so if you're interested in watching Question Time and having a little bit of socialist analysis, then do continue watching. If you're not interested in that, then you can watch it on iPlayer. Okay, they're your two choices really. Yeah, great, fantastic. We are live. Really helpful. So the reason I wanted to start a little bit earlier and was talking to myself for 7 minutes because I'm using new streaming software, is that we had some really good news in my local area. So I'm in Brighton and I'm in a seat called Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven. And you may have seen on Twitter that Lloyd Russell-Moyle, who's a good socialist MP, he has moved to the Green Party. I knew this was going to happen, and actually I'm pretty sure the announcement was supposed to happen tomorrow. I think it was supposed to come out in the Times. And there was an embargo on the story, and I think a journalist broke the embargo. So probably behind the scenes there's been lots of people who've been rushing around trying to sort of sort it out and make sure the media stuff is going out about it. But to cut a very long story short, which I was in the middle of telling 7 minutes ago, Lloyd's a really great guy. He'd be a great candidate for the seat, although there'll be an open selection, obviously, and whoever's selected will be selected. And people locally are really upset with what happened to him. He was basically what happened, a charge from 8 or so years ago was dug up, I think probably by somebody on the Labour right, fishing for dirt. Without any investigation, Lloyd was suspended from the party and was therefore ineligible to stand. And then Chris Ward, who is a mate of Starmer and was part of the Labour Together project to undermine Corbynism and bring in Starmer in the first place to stand for the leadership, he got the seat. And so what we've ended up with in Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven is a ghoul on the Labour right. So really good news today about Lloyd, in my view. Let me just see if I can find this live stream. I sometimes struggle to find it when I'm going live. I probably have to search for it, don't I? Right, let's move to the right view and let's get going. Which one is it? It's that one. All right, let's get going.
As every week reflects the electoral picture across the nation. Welcome to Question Time on the BBC News Channel, iPlayer and Sounds. For the government, the Care Minister Stephen Kinnock. He's previously been a Labour spokesman on defence and immigration. Before politics, he worked for the British Council and was once forced out of Russia. Making his Question Time debut, Joe Robertson, Conservative MP for Isle of Wight East, who entered Parliament last year and sits on the Commons Health and Social.
Guy just looks evil, doesn't he? I probably shouldn't have said that, but it's what popped in my head. Let's continue.
Care Committee. Another new face tonight and a rising star for the Liberal Democrats, Josh Babarinde. Before entering politics, he set up Cracked It, a mobile phone repair service staffed by former young offenders, which won a series of awards. Ella Whelan is a journalist, cultural commentator and author of What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. Zoe Lyons is a comedian and TV presenter who survived Celebrity SAS Who Dares Wins and Celebrity Mastermind, so after that, and our Question Time should be a doddle.
Right, so there's basically no left person on the panel today. The person that was described as a journalist is actually she's deputy editor of Spiked. She's very much anti-woke. That's probably how she described herself. She's very much on the right. Josh Babarinde, he's probably about as left-wing as this panel gets. And we've got the comedian, I suppose, who's probably quite left-wing. But essentially we're dealing with a panel where the left are basically absent. So I might have to provide that commentary myself.
Good evening. Welcome to our panel. Welcome to our audience here in Loughborough. Very good to see you. And welcome to you at home. Enjoy the programme. Join in on social media. Just sit back and watch. Whatever takes your fancy. Right, let's start with our first question, which is from Roger Haycock.
Will new immigration rules stop the small boats?
It's literally every week, isn't it? I'm putting my head in my hands because I don't know if it's just my bad luck, but every single time I stream, first question is immigration, like literally every single time. And I make the same point every single time, which is that the right in British politics have consistently said for decades that we can't talk about immigration, but it seems to be the only thing we ever talk about. And the other thing that annoys me about having to talk about it is I've got a fairly, I'm not that left-wing on immigration compared to other people on the left. I basically think that the British people want fair, and that word's important, but controlled migration into the UK, and we don't have that at the moment. So I do think it's sensible to do, to have controls on migration when immigration is historically very high into the UK. But the way that we do that is we are sensible with our policy, and we think about, well, what does the UK need in terms of people doing jobs. What you certainly don't do is stop students coming in, because our universities are now struggling because there's not enough money coming from foreign students, and university education was a massive export for the UK. And what you should do about small boat crossings is to have a humane policy where there are safe and legal routes, probably in France, if they would be amenable to that, where people can claim asylum, because the only reason people are having to come across with smuggling gangs in small boats is because there aren't those routes. And actually, one of the things Labour announced amongst that package of measures, which I didn't support, one of the things they announced is that they're going to introduce more safe and legal routes, which I think is quite a nice example of what's going wrong with Labour, that sometimes they come out with policies that I would support, but they are so downplayed that people aren't even aware of them. That's the one thing in the package of measures which I did support. All right, let's see what everyone else has got to say.
So we've heard a lot about this week. Some of the headlines of that: refugee status to become temporary. You have to leave if your country of origin is deemed safe. These are all plans at the moment, not actually laws. Indefinite leave to remain to be accessible for refugees after 20 years, not the current 5. Refugees won't automatically have the right to bring family members. There's a whole list of new changes. The government's talked about it being a moral mission. Some Labour MPs have called it cruel and dystopian. Stephen, where do you stand on that spectrum?
Well, I stand very clearly with what our Home Secretary has said, which is if you want to build a cohesive and well-integrated society, you have to control your borders. What she talked about, I think, with great passion and conviction, both in the chamber and on the media, is that you see this journey that people go on from resentment of a system that's not working, of people being in asylum hotels, of the draw on public services for people who may or may not then have their asylum claim granted. That resentment can develop into anger, and that anger can develop into hatred. So the driving force of what we are doing to fix the small boats crisis that was left to us by the previous government is about building a society that is well integrated, that is cohesive, and where that anger and resentment is dealt with. Now,
okay, well, I've got lots to say about this. Part of the reason that the far right are able to gain the foothold that they are clearly having in our politics, and the reason why reform are on the rise, is precisely because the Labour Party have not done enough about bread and butter issues. They haven't been very good at their communication of even the things that they have done that I would support, like the Employment Rights Bill. and they haven't done enough to tackle inequality. And the stuff that they have done, that they've shouted the loudest about, the difficult decisions, so-called, have been things like failing to do anything about the 2-child benefit limit, being punitive in relation to personal independence payments, tackling the elderly. All of the sort of negative stuff has been directed towards those groups. And furthermore, Starmer's rhetoric in relation to this has been appalling. What we need from the Labour Party is a leader who's going to come out very strongly against the rhetoric of the far right. And that's why people have a problem with this. And it's also the policy, but if you're going to talk about having controlled immigration, you've also got to have sophisticated rhetoric where, you don't dehumanize people coming into this country to flee war and persecution. There's a way of doing this debate. There's a way of talking about immigration that allows us to have a fair system and to have controls that doesn't dehumanize people. And the Labour Party just haven't managed to do that. And unfortunately, that is leading to the rise of Farage. And it is on them. It's on the Labour Party. They've allowed this to happen because they trashed the left out of office. They trashed them in office. They destroyed their broad coalition. They alienated their voter base. And they created the perfect conditions for Farageism to be on the rise. We might be able to do something about that in the next election, but it's going to require either electoral reform or a real effort at tactical voting to make sure that the left can be united against Farage.
We have to do that in a way that deals with both the push factors and the pull factors. And what a lot of the...
And this is bollocks as well, right? So the idea that a refugee who is risking their lives to come into the UK by crossing the Channel in a really dangerous crossing where they may lose their lives in the freezing cold and horrible conditions, the idea that anything the British government could do could act as a further disincentive given the conditions that they're already having to contemplate, I just think is ridiculous. It's not going to work. What you need to do is have safe and legal routes, and you need to have an agreement that Britain will take its fair share of refugees, have that agreement with the rest of the European Union, and then you can have the kind of controls that we're talking about here. But everything else, anything else that you do, is just going to lead to a further rise in the right.
Announcements that we've had this week are about those pull factors. It is about recognising that asylum claims across Europe are going down, and yet they've been going up in the UK. So there is clearly something that is attracting people to get on those small boats and make those very, very dangerous journeys. And that is what we are dealing with in ensuring that we bring fairness and control to the system. Once you have that fairness and control, you can deal with those forces of division who just want to exploit grievances, the likes of Nigel Farage, who never come with any serious plans or solutions. They simply want to exploit the grievances. And the final point I would make on this, Fiona, is let's not forget that it was people like Farage and Boris Johnson who said, vote for Brexit, we'll take back control. And precisely the opposite has happened. We have lost control of our borders since Brexit. The small boats issue didn't exist when we were in the European Union and in the Dublin Convention, and it was the loss of that ability to deal with those returns.
People were coming on lorries, let's not forget that.
Well, but the small boats issue specifically focused on this issue, which I think is just so divisive and so visible in terms of the challenges that we face. The lorries issue has always been there, although, of course, the previous Labour government, David Blunkett and Nicolas Sarkozy did the deal on that, which reduced it dramatically. All of that stuff about take back control of our borders, legal immigration through the roof since we left the European Union, and the small boats crisis existing in a world that didn't exist when we were in the Dublin Convention. So I think it's about dealing with the mess that we have inherited and building that integrated and cohesive society. But to do that, you must first take control of your borders.
I mean, this rhetoric's not going to work, is it? Because people don't blame Nigel Farage and Brexit for the current situation, they blame, rightly, in my view, they blame the governments they voted for. And of course, people are going to be annoyed if they vote for a Conservative Party that said we're going to get immigration down to the tens of thousands, and it ends up being hundreds of thousands. I think it was close to 1 million net migration at one point. Of course, people are going to be annoyed by that because there's a basic failure of democracy there. You tell people that you're going to do something and then fail to deliver it, and in fact you deliver the exact opposite, then of course that's going to breed resentment in the whole political system, and that's going to mean that people are going to start reaching for extreme solutions. And I just wish politicians would acknowledge some of that, to be honest. And I wish politicians would just have a better analysis of what has led to the current situation. They do just seem so out of touch with what most people are thinking. And look, I disagree with Farage on migration. I'm just trying to offer an analysis of why people are attracted to that form of politics. They're attracted to it because mainstream politicians offered solution or professed to offer solutions, and then the opposite happened. And that democratic deficit is always going to be exploited by figures like Farage, who's been banging the drum his whole life, his whole career. He's been saying the political establishment is stitching you up, I'm the alternative. Well, the perfect recipe to help him.
Will these rules, or will these plans anyway, stop the votes, Joe?
I would like them to. I think there is a consensus that illegal migration needs to be stopped. It needs to be stopped.
There's nothing illegal about claiming asylum, of course.
As quickly as possible. I think the Home Secretary has been brought in. Let's not forget, she wasn't the Home Secretary at the beginning of this Parliament. She's been brought in to deal with this. And I think the government has finally realised this is a lot more challenging than they thought it was in opposition.
But do you support these plans? Do you think they will stop the small boats?
I support any plans, and in fact, the Conservatives will back the government where plans are put in place to reduce small boat crossings.
I wish the media would stop using this language of small boats. It's so dehumanising not to center the lives that are on board those boats that are risking their lives, and those are people who've died crossing the channel. It just feels like needlessly dehumanising language to talk about and center the boats rather than the people that are on board them.
And reduce illegal migration. I do have some concerns about some of the things that haven't been said. So there is a cohort of people who come here, apply for asylum, and their asylum applications are rejected. About half of those who apply are rejected.
It isn't half of those who apply. We don't know the true figure because asylum applications are so far behind, but about 2/3 of people's applications are accepted. So that's just incorrect. It still means 1/3 of claims are not accepted. If my figures are right, please check and correct me in the comments, but it's certainly not half. The majority of claims for asylum for people who come here on small boats are accepted. So what we are talking about is the majority of people who do come here have genuine asylum claims, and that's in the context of a system that doesn't want to accept the claims, right? So that means that 2/3 of people have such a strong claim for asylum that they can't be rejected by the British government, which means that they're fleeing horrendous conditions, war, persecution, political oppression, genuine danger.
But they can't be returned home to their country of origin. So 3 of the top 4 countries of origin, Afghanistan, Iran and Eritrea, they can't be returned home. The Home Secretary still doesn't have a plan for what to do.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? If things are so bad in their country of origin that the British government can't return them home because they're fearful that if they did, their human rights would be violated, then why are we not accepting their claims? It's such weird logic that he's employing here. The only reason that the European Convention on Human Rights would ever be deployed as a reason not to send somebody back to the country they've come from is if their lives are genuinely at risk and if their human rights are at risk. So if that is an impediment, it's probably because we should have been accepting their application in the first place.
In the House of Commons on Monday, she said she's exploring return hubs with third-party countries. Exploring. She wouldn't say who, and she wouldn't say whether a deal could be done or when it could be done.
So what
and I challenged her, and I said, I said to her, there is a third country who will do a deal on return hubs. It's called Rwanda. And we were having that conversation with Rwanda. Do you know what? It's the one country she has ruled out talking to, having a return hub with, is Rwanda. And it's the one country we know are open to doing that. So she needs to be able to spell out what she's going to do. And I would just say to Stephen on this idea that it's all small boats, the biggest country of origin for those who apply for asylum is Pakistan. Over 10,000 people from Pakistan applied for asylum last year. Just over 100 came in small boats. The vast majority came via other routes or were here already. And she does need to be honest with the British people, because I think, frankly, and I understand it, the British people have had enough of being told short gimmick policies.
I don't understand what his point is here. People are entitled to claim asylum. Like, as soon as you utter those words, then we have an obligation to explore your case. Obviously, we need to set up a system where we can process claims quicker. But if people are coming from countries and they don't have a claim, then we can reject them and we can deport them. Like, there's nothing controversial about that. So what we need is a system that can process people quicker and be humane towards those who do have valid reasons to be claiming asylum here, and deport people who do not have a valid claim. And you know, it's sort of, this guy's just making no sense to me.
On immigration. So I wish the Home Secretary well, but she's got to do more than what she's announced earlier this week.
Man here in the front.
This seems to me to be aping reforms policies. You're doing like a shallow copy of them. The ECHR alterations are unacceptable. All we need to do is enforce the laws we've got. These things are there. We shouldn't be doing in this state in the first place. It's only because we don't enforce what we've got, and everything else is really just trying to look like reform so that people in that place are attracted to vote for Labour. And that's not really you being yourselves or doing what you believe in, I believe. I think it's...
Yeah, I mean, this is I don't agree with this guy, right? But he's making a point about how voters think about these things, right? Labour aping reform does not help them electorally. If the next election ends up being about immigration, Labour will lose. The only hope that they have is trying to shift the narrative so that they can talk about something that is going well. Unfortunately, nothing is going well. Because usually Labour do well when the National Health Service is front and centre, but actually it seems to be the case that they're even struggling to bring down waiting lists in the National Health Service from those historic highs. It might be that they're just, I think they are actually a doomed political project, Starmerism. I don't think they can recover. And I think they're getting to a point where it might become terminal for them if the Green Party overtake them consistently in the polls. And by that I mean all of the polls. I don't just mean YouGov and Focal data. The other poll, there seems to be a bit of a disparity in the polling actually at the moment, with some polls showing the Greens really high and other polls showing them really low. But as soon as the Green Party consistently poll ahead of Labour, it becomes existential for them. Because the argument they want to deploy at the next election is it's either us or reform, and they're not going to be able to make that argument if the Green Party are clearly in second place. But anyway, my point is, banging on about immigration constantly is not going to help Labour. It's only ever going to help reform.
A wrong-footed thing to do, and I think it'll end badly.
Man here in the tie.
Are words like invasion and swarm the right kind of language we political leaders should be using in engaging in a debate about this?
No. And those are not words, I think, that the Home Secretary used.
No, these are words that, on the right, that's what they're using.
Okay.
And is that helpful for us to engage in a debate?
No. Josh?
The short answer to that question...
I might be wrong, but I feel like Liz Truss or somebody like that used words to that effect. I'm going to have to say allegedly because I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I've heard her say things like that. Obviously on the right and the far right, this sort of language is commonplace. We all saw the Breaking Point poster during the Brexit referendum.
is no. It is appalling, it is immoral, and it is un-British to be using divisive rhetoric to describe some of the people who are among the most vulnerable people in the world, people who are fleeing famine, war, human.
Did this guy just get married to his husband? Am I thinking about somebody else? But he was saying that a member of Parliament had proposed to their husband and the thing. If so, I hope they have a nice wedding.
Human rights abuses, and that cannot go on. And every politician, in fact everybody on this panel, has a responsibility to put forward their arguments with dignity and with compassion. That is the British thing to do, and not what we're seeing from the likes of Nigel Farage.
And what
not
about,
what we're seeing
from the
likes...
government, Josh?
Well, I think that the government are increasingly aping the likes of Reform, using some really spiky rhetoric to describe this issue. Now, don't get me wrong. It's so true that thanks to the Conservatives' way that they managed our immigration system, people have lost confidence in the way that it works, and there needs to be action to restore that confidence. I think that the government have missed a trick to think outside the box here. We've heard lots of language around how people seeking asylum should make a contribution. Well, for me, one of the greatest forms of contribution someone can make to our country is by getting a job and paying tax. But this government is saying, no, we're not going to give people seeking asylum the right to work, despite the fact that Denmark, who they model these changes on, do give people seeking asylum the right to work after 6 months. And in that way, folks could pay their way rather than have to rely on the state to fund the hotels and whatever else it might be. That is a smart, compassionate way of being able to tackle this issue without diving in to the rhetoric that is dividing our communities and is profoundly against every value that this country has fought hard for.
Yeah, absolutely insane that refugees are not allowed to work. There's loads of things you could do, right? But the reason that Labour and the Conservatives don't want to pursue policies like that is, I think they're worried that if refugees are able to integrate within our society, that there'll be resistance to deportations if asylum claims are unsuccessful. Personally, if I was tackling this, I'd want to introduce safe and legal routes. I've said that already. But what I would also do probably on day one, or definitely on day one, is I'd grant automatically applications from countries where there's high acceptance rates. So I just sweep the board and say, look, all of those people who have made applications from these countries, they're accepted. And then that would get the wait list down on asylum applications so that you get into a position where you could start processing claims quicker, and you could start to get a grip of the system. And I'd also do things that I can't believe the government haven't considered, but we had a scheme for Ukrainian refugees where British people could sign up to house refugees from Ukraine. We should put a similar scheme in place for all refugees so that they don't have to be housed in hotels, that people can open up their homes to refugees. What we need to try and do to heal these tensions in our society is make refugees a part of our communities and a part of our societies. Because at the moment, we're intentionally not doing that. And of course, that's going to have the intended outcome of stoking up division.
And do you think that would encourage more people to come? I mean, one of the reasons a number of parties don't suggest that is they want a deterrent in place. Do you not think that, or do you think that might encourage more people to come if they've had to come here and work?
The evidence does not support the idea that giving people the right to work is a pull factor. If you look at some research done by the University of Warwick, they reviewed 30 different studies into this very issue. And what they found is that there's no long-term correlation between destination choice, where someone would choose to seek asylum, and labour market access, whether they have the right to work. That is the evidence, and that's why the government should consider giving them the right to work.
Surely, as a country, we're missing a trick as well. If we have all of these people who are coming over, seeking asylum, many of them coming from countries where there have been doctors, nurses, engineers, scientists, and we're sticking them away and not allowing them to integrate in any way, shape or form, checks considered, that we are missing a trick on all of that talent that is also coming here. And it's it's clearly this topic is such a hot button, a political hot button, but in all of that rhetoric, the human side of it gets lost. And there are so many human beings.
Yes, I am reading the chat. I just haven't got it on the stream today. Yeah, it's typical of this sort of show that the really left-wing voice is the sort of random comedian that they've got on, isn't it?
Just trying to better themselves and better their lives. And of course, there are people coming here illegally who do not have a right to asylum, and they should be sent back. But the people that do have a right, and who are predominantly from Afghanistan, a country where we use so many interpreters, they helped us during the combating the Taliban. We should be utilising their skills and integrating. And the problem that we've got to now is that we've got to them and us. And that is why there is the divide and the flag waving that you see, the them and us. And unfortunately, we stick them in places where people are already struggling and are impoverished, or there's deprivation. And then that fuels the rhetoric of, look at them, they're in hotels, they're getting everything paid for, blah, 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 blah. Of course, then there's madness and there's hatred that comes out of that. It's not been cleverly managed. It's not been done properly.
All right, Ella, I'm going to come to you. I'm just going to hear a little bit more from our audience first. Yes, man, there.
Yeah, absolutely right there. Exactly, I mean, very similar to what I've just said, really. If you want to have a humane system of dealing with immigration, then key to that system is going to be creating a sense of community. As soon as people meet people in these situations, their natural compassion will come out in most cases, right? And when the people we're talking about are our colleagues, our friends, our neighbours, we'll be much more likely for the debate to shift. So whatever we can do to make that a reality, I think it's the right thing to do, even if we end up rejecting the claim and we end up having to, deny them, refugee status in the UK. Yeah, just to address some of the things in the chat. Yeah, I am listening to the chat. There's no such thing as an illegal immigrant into the UK. People are entitled to take an irregular route under the Refugee Convention, absolutely. And refugees do not have to make a claim in the first country they arrive at. Many refugees, of course, come to Britain for a variety of reasons, but one of the key ones is the language. And the fact that we were a global empire is a big part of that, and is a big part of the whole immigration story. I'm not intending to set up a Discord, and the reason for that is I think it will create a lot of work for me to have to engage with it. I'm not really very good at engaging in social media in general, actually, which is an odd thing for you when who's become a YouTuber to say. But I find I try and keep off X these days. I don't know what other people's experiences of X are, but if you forget to change the tab from For You to just the people you follow, you can enter a sort of really dark place very quickly, and you're thinking, how the hell did this happen? So I've got no intention of setting a Discord. I can't really be persuaded on that at the time being. So it's not happening. There we go.
With the glasses and the pinkish shirt, yeah. Yes, there's a microphone above you.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask, because a lot of the rhetoric surrounding this, the reasoning for this rather, seems to be that this is a policy designed to tackle divisive rhetoric employed by people like Farage, and that's fair enough. But I don't quite understand how this is an effective way to tackle Farage as how it's been framed, because surely, as has been stated, Farage is using this as a divisive issue. Surely he'll just move on to another issue after it, and then all you've essentially done is eroded the rights of refugees and benefited nobody else. In fact,
not just to erode the rights of refugees. This guy's quite right. The rhetoric from Reform, and increasingly from the Conservatives, and in fact, I think they've committed to this, is that the intention is to pull out of the ECHR. And the truth of the matter is that the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to a family life is the article that's often cited, is not a major factor in the reason why it isn't possible to deal with this situation. This is really a confected narrative by the right. There have been some high-profile cases, but it's very, very rare for deportations to be blocked on human rights grounds. And when deportations are blocked for that reason, as I've alluded to earlier, it's because there's a genuine risk to that person that if we deport them to the country that they're going to face horrendous human rights abuses. So this is it's a sign of how toxic our discourse has become that we're even discussing this. And then, of course, the obvious point to make is that these are our rights too. Now, the right's response to that is to say that Britain had a strong history of respecting human rights before we ever entered the ECHR in the 1950s. Well, I'm actually just not convinced by that. I don't think we did have a very strong history of that. If you look at history through the lens of the working class, up until very recently, working class people didn't even have the right to vote. And, when we wanted to try and win those rights, remember the Peterloo Massacre? Remember the struggles of the suffragettes? So I think there's a huge danger here. And of course, if we pull out of the ECHR, which is a higher court, so it allows a further appeal above the national level, that provides us with an extra degree of protection because it's one step removed from Parliament and the British state. If we don't have that, then that means that British courts are the only courts that can decide on our rights. And of course, Parliament is sovereign, right? So if the Supreme Court in a human rights case was to issue a declaration of incompatibility, which is what they do in human rights cases, against the British government, and we weren't part of the ECHR, but we had some kind of human rights legislation, Parliament could just legislate to resolve the incompatibility in the government's favour. So, and if you think about how Parliament works, a government with a majority is always going to be able to pass law using the Parliament Act if necessary. So we'd only really have human rights in name, right? Because the structures of a parliamentary system where a majority in one of the chambers is enough to pass law essentially means that you've got no protection because there's no entrenchment possible in the UK like it is in the US, and there would no longer be a higher law that you could appeal to. So it's incredibly dangerous, right? Sorry, that was a long explanation, but I think you've got to have an understanding of the British Constitution, how it works, to understand how dangerous it would be to simply rely on statute to protect our rights. The ECHR is fundamental. And I've got skin in the game here, as people who know me and follow me on Twitter and what have you will know, but others won't. I was arrested at a protest recently, and my defence is that I am protected by the European Convention of Human Rights as it relates to freedom of speech and expression. So I need that right? So it's not even in the abstract that I'm talking about this. And if you think that could never happen to you, don't be so ridiculous. Of course it can. We need to have human rights. Otherwise, things can go to a very dark place.
Weakened your own position.
All right, let's hear from the two men in the front. Yes, a bit further forward. Yes, man in the glasses.
Yeah. Do you think the UK government should now leave the ECHR and revert more back to the Dublin Convention? Because when we were running on those guidelines in 2018, I believe, there were only around about 600 people across the channel.
We were in the ECHR, we've been in the ECHR since 1950, right? We don't need to leave the ECHR. You've just proven that by referring to a period where we were in the ECHR, but in the Dublin Convention where this wasn't an issue. So yes, we probably want to have a negotiation with the European Union where we agree to take in a proportion of refugees and agree to returns agreements and things like that. Sensible idea. Leaving the ECHR, bonkers.
And in 2019, that jumped up over 1,800, and now we're at 37,000 plus this year already. We had greater control then. Why do we not revert back to those guidelines that we were working for before?
All right, let me hear from the man next to you.
Okay. So as much as I like Shabana Mahmood's plan, I think that it's brave. but I also think it's naive. So learning lessons from Denmark, a population with like more than 10 times lesser of that of the UK's, I think it's really, really naive. But I also welcome her plan. I think if it works, I will vote Labour in the next election. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but yeah.
Because what, you didn't vote Labour before?
No, well, I couldn't vote, but
Oh, right. Okay.
I couldn't vote.
Right.
But I think that it is a real issue, and I don't think that people should put a blanket over it. It's a real issue.
Is there anyone else in the audience who supports what Shabana Mahmood had to say this week? Yes, man there with the glasses.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think government has finally woken up and listened to public opinion. The Conservatives tried. They used what I thought was a good deterrent in terms of Rwanda, but that was pushed aside. And I work in the NHS. And I've seen record immigration put huge pressure on the NHS. Many of my patients can't get to see a GP face to face. I've got older patients waiting 3 years for operation.
I wonder if that could have anything to do with austerity. I wonder if that could be the real cause of why it is that we don't have enough resource going into things. Because austerity compounded itself, right? You didn't just have the fact that it had short-term political costs economically. We were in a recession following the financial crisis, and we did exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do, according to simple Keynesianism. What that does is it compounds itself, right? Because if you're failing to invest, then you're not investing in long-term growth, and these effects compound over time and get worse. So the failure to invest has led to a total lack of productivity since the financial crisis, stagnant real wages, and of course, things get worse over time because if you haven't fixed the roof, as it were, and I do mean literally fix the roof, if a school building needs a repair, for example, and there isn't enough money to do it, the hole just gets bigger. There are certain forms of investment that shouldn't be delayed, and all investment that the state is doing is necessary investment, right? That just should be done as soon as possible. And there's been a real failure to do all of that. So it's not to do with immigration, it's to do with the failure of the British state to invest in basic services, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in all the things that we need to live as a decent society. Immigration is simply a scapegoat, I'm afraid.
Operations, A&E departments full because they're full up with all the wrong patients. And this is really because our population has exploded in numbers, really, because of failure of successive governments to control. I'm a son of an immigrant, and I believe in controlled immigration, but I think it just went out of control, and now, Shabana's finally woken up, and hopefully, and I think we should leave the ECHR because I think we're going to get lots and lots of legal rulings which are going to fight Shabana's policies. I've got my doubts, really.
Okay, let me just remind people, ECHR, of course, a European Convention on Human Rights. Ella, let me come to you. So the question is...
It's maddening, this. Because only people in positions of privilege can say that, right? People who feel like, and might be wrong, right, that they're never going to have to rely upon their human rights. And they just don't seem to realise what the ECHR is and why it exists. It was brought in after the Holocaust in the 1950s. It was an idea really put forward by Winston Churchill. It isn't a radical leftist idea. The idea is that we set in train a set of European rights so that nothing like the Holocaust can happen again. Nothing like Nazi Germany could happen again. And it is a shame that broad-based public support for something as basic as that has gone in the UK. The fact that I'm even having to argue for this is baffling and worrying. But there will be people who watch this. If I get the normal slew of right-wingers who seem to be attracted to these videos, the comments will be full of people having a go at me for this because they've imbibed the rhetoric of the far right and they're convinced that that my agenda must be something other than what it is, which is that I just simply believe in a basic set of liberal freedoms that we're all entitled to as a bare minimum. And of course, as a socialist, I'd go well beyond that and really also want to think about our freedoms within the workplace, our democratic freedoms, to have ownership and control over our working lives as well.
Legal migration, which you're talking about as well, so obviously dwarfs illegal migration. But the question is, will what the government has proposed this week stop the small boats?
Probably not, because of what the gentleman up there just said, which is that I think that Shabana Mahmood has done something quite important, which is finally given a parliamentary voice to discussions that people have been having in the country for a very long time and taking this issue seriously. But you have to have the stomach to crack the whip on the problems in the civil service.
This woman calls herself a feminist, right? And I don't know what she's about to say. But there are women and children on those boats, right? If you're going to call yourself a feminist, you need to stand for all women, including refugee women.
Problem with lawyers, problems with judges, indeed problem with the ECHR, which is going to thwart any attempt domestically to deal with this.
So do you agree with the man in the front that we should leave the ECHR?
Yeah, I don't think it would be the sort of magic bullet for solving everything, but I think in the same way that leaving the European Union was not just important, it was vital because it was a challenge to British politicians to be wholly accountable for controlling borders. I mean, you couldn't have a discussion about us controlling our borders without Brexit. So it's kind of ludicrous, Stephen, for you to make out like Brexit is a barrier to this discussion.
Oh, okay. I didn't. So I'm just responding to the chat. She's not a feminist. She's against feminism, which is an interesting position. If that is her position, it's an interesting position for a woman to have, isn't it? That you want to end feminism. Okay.
It's been the facilitator for this discussion in many ways. But I just, it's interesting the way in which we frame these things. The gentleman in the front here said, is it right to use nasty words like invasion and swarm? No. I don't think it's also either, right to talk about the asylum seekers as all being the most vulnerable. It's more complex than that. We know it's more complex than that. It's neither sort of, the idea of people using words like hordes of enemies, all these horrible words, and neither is it all sort of crying women and children fleeing war. There's complexities and problems here. So stop with the kind of like lazy characterizations. And actually, I think what most people want is not, most people's concern isn't that the UK is full of people on the brink of far-right extremism and Shabana Mahmood is coming to sort of civilize us all and make us all nice again. The issue of immigration is a much more fundamental question for people about, do we have control of our country, of what happens here, of who comes here, of our laws, our borders, all the rest of it. But also, are we involved in the discussion? Because up until, this is why I think Mahmood really needs to be praised, even though I think the detail of her plans are, you can pick them apart, is that for years and years and years now, any discussion of immigration has been shut down as far right.
Oh my God, it hasn't. It literally hasn't. It literally hasn't. I'm just gonna take a moment for myself because I'm so annoyed. It drives up my blood pressure. I'm drinking wine on this stream for a reason because question time is stressful. It's all we ever talk about, and it has been for years. I was watching Question Time. I'm 40 now, unfortunately. I was watching Question Time when I was 15 and we were talking about immigration. It's not a new conversation we're having. The reason that its salience has increased is because the overall level of immigration has increased. And the reason people are angry about that is because they were told by politicians, mostly on the right, particularly conservative politicians, that they would bring immigration down, and they didn't. So there was a failure of democracy there. And when people started to get frustrated about this, the electoral system prevented them from voting for parties that they wanted to support. So UKIP back in 2015 got 3.8 million votes and 1 seat at the general election. I'm in favour of proportional representation because I think it's a pressure valve in the system. If you allow people to vote for parties they genuinely support, if you've got a political system that denies them any sense that they've got representation in Parliament, so their voices aren't heard, then what you have is a situation where pressure builds. And I think that's part of the story that is underappreciated about the rise of Farageism in British politics, that it's been so underrepresented in Parliament, this set of views. But it certainly hasn't been absent from the public discourse, because the right-wing press, question time appearances, platforms like GB News, these voices are all around us, and we're now having to deal with the fact that we can't even go on Twitter because the algorithm is so ridiculously feeding us ridiculous discourses from the right that are plainly false. That's become a space that I can't be in anymore. I used to be obsessed with Twitter. It used to be a great platform. I can't go on there anymore, really. I'm on there every now and then. I was on there today only because of what I was talking about earlier with the Green Party having a defection from a former Labour MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle.
And that is just the case. Anybody who raised the issue of immigration has been called a racist or dismissed as some kind of Farageite. And I'm very glad that we're having the conversation now to be able to say, what immigration system do we want? Do we want it to be liberal? Do we want it to be strict? But this has been the first time, this is actually the first bit, I would say, of proper Brexity legislation that says, right, we are in charge, we can make these decisions, what kind of immigration system do we want? So I want it to work. I want her sort of straight talking, telling people to sod off in the Commons and all the rest of it to have some material impact. But unless Labour pushes through with the guts to actually make it work, it's only just going to be talk.
I mean, look, we've had a sensible conversation about immigration for years, as I've just said, but it's worth saying that this rhetoric about trying to tell us that we shouldn't talk about racism in this debate is designed to silence and actually spiked as a platform that pretends to be in favour of free speech and pretends to be against silencing. But the discourse that she's using is actually an attempt to silence people from legitimately saying that a lot of this discourse is racist. And it comes from a racist place, and it's promulgated by a media that is racist, and it is put forward by politicians who are racist. We saw in the news this week about Nigel Farage, and these are additional allegations. We already knew that it was alleged by a teacher at Dulwich College, where Nigel Farage went to school, that he went round a quiet Sussex village singing Nazi songs when he was in the combined cadet force with his mates. We now know that there are fresh allegations against him, that he used to be openly racist, not just against Jewish people, but against people who were Pakistani as well, using language that I'm never going to use on my channel. And there was a story that was reported on. Again, these are just allegations, and I'm sure Farage would deny them. I'm obliged to say that. There was a report that said that on the school bus, Farage used to sing songs about gas chambers. So he hasn't responded to these allegations, and they are just allegations. But I think Nigel Farage is a racist. That's my opinion. I also think that he is a hardcore Thatcherite, and that he will cut public services in a way that will be massively destructive to those who are voting for him or intend to vote for him. And that people who may agree with him about some things should think really carefully about their communities and about what these massive cuts of public services will mean for their communities. I think he was proposing £150 billion worth of cuts. It might have been 50 billion, but we're talking about huge numbers in his. It wasn't a manifesto. It was called something else. But he's a hardcore Thatcherite, and actually that's my bigger worry, that he'll come to power and it'll be Liz Truss, but with a leader that is impossible to replace, actually, because Reform UK's constitution is set up almost like a private company with Nigel Farage at its head, and there isn't an obvious mechanism to get rid of him once he becomes Prime Minister internally within that party, because of the way it's set up. So we might end up with like Liz Truss, who we can't get rid of, which is a terrifying prospect.
We talk. Woman in the glass.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I do think that I just wanted to return to the point about the rhetoric and the use of that, the weaponising of that rhetoric around immigration by the far right, because I do feel that in community sense, it has polarised people's viewpoints. And certainly teaching, educating young people in our community today, I would have said that they are, as a group, almost self-regulating and have a lot of very strong opinions. But this has really kind of polarised those issues. And I feel it's had a real dent on the kind of like the way that we feel about our community. All right.
I missed a bit of that because I was thinking about something else, but I think she was saying that people are self-regulating what they express out loud about their opinions. Yeah, of course they are. It's literally something John Stuart Mill wrote about in the 19th century. He called it the stultifying uniformity of social convention in a book called On Liberty, published 1867. Right, it's not new, right? This idea that we self-regulate what we're willing to express because we're worried about social stigma. This idea of cancel culture, it's nothing new. You know, obviously, there are things that we don't say out loud in a civilized society because we're worried about what other people will think, and that's a good thing. Because if people didn't self-regulate what they were willing to say out loud, we'd live in a much worse society where people, and we're starting to see that because people are becoming more and more emboldened about what they're willing to say. Just responding to the chat, Film Nerdy, set up a politics YouTube channel, and if you already have people in the chat, follow him. I'm sure it'll be good stuff if he's following me. He must be a sound lefty.
Let me hear one more point. I'll come back to you, Steve. I know you want to respond to some of this. Yes, woman there.
When we talk about illegal immigration, when Labour came into leadership, one of the strap lines that Keir used a lot was that he was going to smash the gangs. That seems to have disappeared. Where's the conversation about that? And where is the accountability? Because it feels like Labour's plans are now...
This lady seems to be expecting consistency from Keir Starmer. I'm sorry, you're not going to get it. I think my memory of him goes back a little bit further than you. I remember the 10 pledges that he ran on, where he pledged that he would be Corbyn in a suit. What happened to that?
Basically a reaction to make sure that they still have the respect and power, because when you look at the polls, they're not going to win the next election.
Stephen, not exactly a vote of confidence there. I think it's fair to say. I mean, there's a number of things that have come out here. One is it actually going to stop the small boats? And you're clearly do you think that's kind of vanished as an issue? And then a number of points equally about asylum seekers giving them jobs so they can contribute, which is not government policy. Why isn't it?
The risk if you do that is it becomes even more of a pull factor. So it's currently 12 months. I know the Liberal Democrats think it should be reduced to 6 months, but our view is if we do that, it becomes too much of a pull factor. But we think a 12-month waiting period that works. But what we really need to do is speed up processing, and we've dramatically increased the speed of processing. Of course, under the Tories, they froze processing altogether, which is one of the reasons why we have so many people stuck in asylum hotels. But I did just want to address this point that a few people made about this idea that we're somehow aping reform. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is nothing Labour or progressive about allowing gangsters to run a people smuggling trade that is trading in human misery. So that is a fundamentally Labour value to stop that from happening. The other point is that we're somehow doing this as a political manoeuvre to occupy the political space that
it winds me up when you get this sort of, I don't know, ungenuine sort of way of expressing things. Because there's plenty of things that it's not very Labour to do, and yet they're doing it. Taking disability benefits off people is not a very Labour thing to do. Restricting the winter fuel allowance, not a very Labour thing to do. Locking people up for exercising their right to protest, not a very Labour thing to do. No, I take that one back actually. Blair did quite a lot of restricting freedom of speech and expression with various acts of parliament. I I've got a long memory of that. The Terrorism Act has been deployed against protesters for quite a long time, not just recently. So maybe it is a Labour thing to do. And actually, in the Blair years, the David Blunkett as Home Secretary was pretty bad as well, actually. So maybe it is a Labour thing to do. Maybe we need to update our minds about what the Labour Party are like in office. There we go. I just can't stand that rhetoric when what the Labour Party means in my brain, i.e. the Labour Party of Attlee, of Wilson, and what it means in practice in my lifetime, i.e. Blair and Starmer, they're very different things. Harold Wilson said the Labour Party is a moral crusade or it is nothing. Well, at the moment, it's going the right route to become literally nothing at the next election if it continues the way it is, because political parties need to have a social basis to have support. They need to have a base within the country. The Labour Party does not have a base at the moment. It will wipe itself out if it continues to pursue policies that are so discordant with the ideological tradition that the Labour Party belongs in.
Reform is in. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. This is a moral imperative. This has to be done, and we're doing it because we believe that it is the right thing to do. And on the point about whether we're aping reform, there is a Reform MP, Sarah Pochin, who has gone out on the media and said that she thinks there's too many black and brown people in our adverts. Has Nigel Farage condemned her comments? Absolutely not. Whereas Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has been out and called that out for what it is, which is racism. So let's be absolutely clear. There are the forces of darkness and division at...
This is why Ash Sarkar is against identity politics, by the way, because it leads to this sort of bollocks, right? This sort of preachy, I'm against this sort of discourse, you know? If you care about black and brown people, if you care about working class people, gay people, trans people, do something about it. Have policies that put forward the interests of ordinary people and minorities. If you don't believe in putting forward those interests, which the Labour Party clearly don't at the moment, shut up and stop talking in identity. Well, I can't say that word. And stop using identity politics as a way of masking the reality of what your policies are doing. We need policies that have a material impact on marginalised people's lives, not just rhetoric.
The gates. And I think we're genuinely in a battle for the soul of our nation. And if we don't get this right, we will let those forces in. So I think the stakes couldn't be higher, and that is why what we have announced this week is absolutely the right thing.
They're in, mate.
To do, and it has got absolutely nothing to do with aping any other political party, any other narrative. These are Labour values being put into practice by a Labour government.
Could I just
very briefly tell you
I might just let my face do the talking during this stream. Labour values, honestly.
Could I just ask, Stephen, I mean, a number of your MPs haven't sounded very supportive. Andy Burnham was supposed to be here tonight. He was put out on the BBC's Twitter feed. He isn't here, you are, and he's already been critical of your immigration policy. I see it's already being reported in the papers. What are you going to do about your own backbenchers who are unsupportive of where your Home Secretary is going? Because you might have to get this through Parliament. You might need us to help you.
Look, every single member of Parliament in the Parliamentary Labour Party stood on a manifesto which...
Yeah, because it was full of right-wing stooges. They got rid of loads of left-wingers when they were selecting for parliamentary candidates, including my local MP who's now joined the Green Party. The Labour Party that we know is pretty right-wing because the Starmerites took over the party. You can read about it in various books now. Where Labour together intentionally undermined the Corbyn leadership, took over the party on a false pretext, moved the party to the right. All of this was part of a plan to seize control of the Labour Party, to make sure that the Labour right controlled it as a faction, and then to use that power to win office. And unfortunately, the analysis only went that far because the Labour right don't really have a platform beyond controlling the Labour Party. And they care about controlling the Labour Party more than anything else. So this is a big part of the reason why Starmerism is a doomed project, because the people around him don't really have any politics outside of the factional war that they want to wage. They don't really have any big ideas. They don't really believe in anything other than winning power.
Said very clearly, we will take back control of our borders after the 14 years of neglect and incompetence from the previous government. They had a Rwanda plan.
Yes, and then you get this sort of thing, like this sort of technocratic argument. Or, in other words, an attempt to create a dividing line that's just about technocratic managerialism, that's just about, well, how well we do things. We had an incompetent government, that's the problem. No. What you need to do as a Labour Party is say it wasn't about incompetence, it was also about fundamental ideological disagreements between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Because at the moment, you've essentially got an argument in this area, immigration, where basically both parties believe the same thing, but one party is saying that they're able to manage the affairs of state better. It's just not good enough, and it's not going to win you the election, because the way that you win an election is by creating a dividing line and by saying we believe in these things because they align with our ideology and our values. And the Labour Party just aren't doing that, and they haven't done it since Tom became leader.
This is about you. Hang on. This is about the government.
They sent 4 volunteers to Rwanda. The Rwandan government said they couldn't take more than 300.
The question is about what you're doing now, and it's quite clear that a number of Labour MPs are really unhappy with this. They may have signed up to controlling the borders, but they don't want to do it this way.
Well, what I would say, with great respect to my colleagues, is that you stood on a manifesto which said we will sort out the small boats crisis. We can't do that simply by hoping that it will go away. We have to take action. That means dealing with the pull factors, which is very much what's been talked about this week, but also dealing with the gangs. We have actually smashed 240 organised immigration gangs. We've stopped 20,000 crossings thanks to our partnership with the French. We are introducing safe and legal routes, the community sponsorship route, which we think has got great potential. We are building that up. That's part of the consultation that is going to be published very soon. So what I would gently encourage my colleagues to do is to look at those measures in the round and to support the government's policy in this vitally important area.
Josh, will you forgive me, because I'm sure we're going to come back to this subject, and I've got to fit some others in.
Thank God. It feels like that was half the programme.
So forgive me, I'm going to move on. Before I do, I just want to tell you that we're in Watford next week. Now, there's something happening. Oh yes, the budget. The budget's happening next week. How could we forget? So anyway, I suspect we might be talking about that and other things as well, I hope. And then the week after that, we're in Dover with a special focus on immigration.
Just whilst they've mentioned the budget, really easy for Rachel Reeves to implement a budget that would work. The reason why she can't is because they boxed themselves in. There was a thing on The Guardian today where you could tinker around with the various policies she might consider. And look, I don't buy into the narrative that we need to have a balanced budget. In fact, I think we actively should avoid having a budget surplus in politics. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's often desirable for governments to spend. You should start with the idea of what does the government need to do to create a good society? What investment do we need? And the government should do that. And the only real constraint on that is the inflationary constraint. So if you get into a situation where there is a bottleneck, where you've reached what Keynesians call full employment, well, it is going to be inflationary. But other than that, you don't need to worry about too much spending. But let's just imagine that I did have to balance the budget. There's a Guardian tool that you can use to see how you would do it. I would just whack up corporation tax. You can make all the money back in that way if that's what you want to do. There's no reason why Britain needs to have a corporation tax rate that is a lot lower than our European neighbours. And then you can deal with other things. I think when I was going through the Guardian thing, I ended up with £32 billion to spend because I'd done things like bringing capital gains tax in line with income tax, increasing the top rate of income tax, increasing corporation tax. There's loads of things that you can do that don't affect ordinary people. But the Labour Party at the last election boxed themselves in and they said they wouldn't do any of that stuff. So they're having to scramble around for a way of balancing the books, as they would see it. I don't think you need to balance the books, and I don't think you should balance the books.
So, if you live in either area, Watford next week, Dover the week before, there was an interesting noise from you all there the week after, so I couldn't quite work out what that meant. Hopefully that's enthusiasm. Watford next week, Dover the week after. If you'd like to come and be part of the audience, apply to the question on website. Here's the address. Follow the instructions, and hopefully we will see you there.
Yeah, the thing about debt is that the government doesn't have to issue bonds in order to spend. The spending comes from the Bank of England issuing money. The government chooses to create a bond market because it wants people to have somewhere to put their savings. And so there's a narrative, isn't there, that we're the British government are beholden to these bond vigilantes. The bond market is a secondary market. The government doesn't have to use that market. The Bank of England can directly finance the government, and in practice, that's what government spending is. So I just don't buy the argument that the government needs to worry too much about bond markets. I don't think it's true. I don't think in practice it's how government spending works. What it does need to worry about is why we have a tax system in general.
Okie dokie. Anil Chand.
Thank you. Did Boris do too little, too late?
So I'm assuming, Anil, you were referring to the report that has come out just at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Yep. Baroness Hallett's report, first of a number on the COVID inquiry. Her view, her conclusion was the government response was too little, too late. Imposing a lockdown a week earlier in March 2020 could have saved 23,000 lives, according to some modelling in England. And she talked about a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of the government led by Boris Johnson.
Yeah, so I'm kind of annoyed that this question's come up as well, because it feels like this political issue's gone away, right? Boris Johnson's no longer Prime Minister, bad decisions were made. The only people who are really interested in this discourse now are the sort of lockdown skeptics. Obviously, we should have implemented lockdown earlier. We saw what happened in other European countries. We had a massive head start. It didn't take any foresight. I remember at the time, at the beginning of March, I was looking at what was happening in other countries, and I was saying we're going to have to lock down. We should do it sooner rather than later. And the rationale behind that is that if you took firmer measures during that crisis earlier, then that would have meant that you could have released the lockdown sooner, and you could have essentially come in and out of lockdown as needed to sort of manage the crisis in a sensible way. And the government didn't do that, and they should have done that. And I think there was plenty of sensible people that were advising them to do that. And the idea that the government were just following the evidence or just following the science is bollocks. The only thing that saved Johnson was a gamble, really. He bought in vaccines. The British government selected a set of vaccines they thought might work, and then they got lucky that some of them did, and so they got ahead of the curve when it came to the vaccine rollout, and that helped them in the end. But that was a gamble. They'd invested significant sums of money on the chance that one of those vaccines would succeed, which it eventually did. I don't really want to go through this debate again, but let's continue. Question time is always painful, so let's continue.
Do you agree?
So COVID was a global pandemic of proportions we've never seen before. It was unprecedented. And the government of the time made a series of decisions based on advice. It made the decisions it thought was right at the time. Now, some people thought we should have locked down earlier, and that's what this report, with hindsight, finds, and I accept the report. But quite a lot of people thought we locked down too harshly. Our measures were too harsh. Now, I respect a number of views at that time about how we should deal with it. But I do also ask that people respect the government did what it thought was right.
What about these comments about a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of government? What's your response to that?
Undoubtedly
actively encouraged by Boris
Johnson that went on at number 10 that should not have gone on. I am not going to defend some of those things that we knew about at the time, by the way. But this report does find that in some cases there was no good decision, right decision to make. And it also finds fault with all devolved nations in Britain as well. So the Scottish government under the SNP and the Welsh government under Labour, as well as the UK government under the Conservatives. But what we must do is ensure that we actually learn the lessons that this COVID inquiry is providing for us, so that, God forbid, this should ever happen again, whoever is in government are fully prepared and those mistakes are not repeated. And if we revert to using this for political point scoring, we will have failed those people, not only who lost their lives, but have lived with the consequences ever after.
Yeah, but the people have got to take accountability for what they said and did. And I'll take accountability. I think I was right about most things, including that we should have locked down early. I think the one thing that I have reflected on and think I was wrong about was how strict we should have been. I was a school teacher at the time and I was part of the National Education Union. And I need to be careful about what I say here because I now work for the NEU. So I need to, as a member of staff, it's difficult for me to comment on NEU policy. I'll just comment on my own opinion, which happened to coincide with what the NEU was campaigning on at the time. But my own opinion was that at the time was that we should have shut schools. And that was because of the risk to vulnerable staff that were working in schools. And I think there was probably a more nuanced policy because the impact of shutting schools was really, really damaging for young people, particularly young people from deprived backgrounds, partly because they didn't have access to resources at home. I think it created a huge problem, and we haven't really recovered from that because the government hasn't really taken an interest in putting the resources in that needed to be put in place to help children to recover from that. So I think that's the thing I regret, that I think there should have been a better policy around schools. But it was quite difficult to implement because health and safety legislation, it basically says that if you believe that you are in danger by going into work, that you can exercise a right under health and safety law to remain at home. And that's what the unions did to shut down schools. It was one of the January lockdowns. I can't remember exactly when it happened, maybe January 2021. I think the government were in a really difficult position and probably couldn't have done otherwise at that point in time. But what I'm saying is I'm just saying I regret being so vociferously in favour of that at the time because I think on the whole, locking schools down did a lot of damage.
Let me just ask you, I mean, you kind of answered, but I just want to be completely clear. When Baroness Hallett, this is her second report incidentally, not her first, when she talks about a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of government, and with Boris Johnson failing to tackle that culture and sometimes actively encouraging it, do you agree with that?
I accept the results of her inquiry. I'm not going to defend that culture that she has identified. But what I would say is that the government at the time took decisions in good faith and includes things like a vaccine rollout, which she commended, by the way, which was a vaccine developed in this country and which was then used around the world. So there were certainly some good outcomes from the way that the government dealt with it. And she does find, Baroness Hallett does find fault of all the devolved nations, but this shouldn't be used as party political point scoring.
Imagine that, concerted government effort and investing in something for the social good, producing outcomes that benefit the whole of humanity. If only we did more of that.
I accept the results of the inquiry in full.
I think one doesn't know how one will behave in a pandemic until one finds oneself in a pandemic. And that, like you say, it was the same for every government having to deal with it. However, I think we were in the very unfortunate position of having Boris Johnson in charge at the time, where he... I remember him taking, I'm going to call it a dishevelled approach to the whole thing, boasting about shaking hands with patients with COVID and then getting COVID himself and almost dying, which is incredibly serious. But, our Prime Minister should have been, A, protecting himself from all that because he was our leader of our country, etc., etc. And we know that, as the pandemic rolled on, there were some very choice decisions that were made. I mean, now looking back, Eat Out to Help Out looks like a farce. It looks like a farcical thing that you would put in a sort of B movie,
It looked like a farce at the time. It was such a stupid policy. I'm not going to go into it, but I was very critical at the time.
Going through a pandemic, it's spread by having contact with other people, it's damaging the economy. Right, everybody go and have lunch together with a £5 off. I mean, it looks so ridiculous now. Apparently Chris Whitty called it eat out to help the virus out.
It's quite a good example, though, of bad policy that's consistent across different ways of doing policy. So it's kind of like a tax cut. It's a policy that's designed to change people's behaviour in some sort of way. So it's a bit like what Liz Truss did, right? So when Liz Truss attempted to cut taxes to stimulate investment, it's a tax cut that's predicated on changing behaviour that will be beneficial to the economy. Much better, much more efficient to just inject the money directly. If they wanted to help hospitality, which was a good, laudable objective, they should have just given hospitality directly money in some way, rather than putting in place a policy to change behaviour to sort of indirectly affect things. It's just bad policy design, basically.
And then, of course, there were the PPE sort of debacle. So I think, I think there were a lot of very dubious behaviours going on. Like I say, next time round, maybe we'll get it better. But I think our greatest fault was having Boris in charge at that time.
Man at the very back.
And who was responsible for that? Lots of people who attacked the best alternative we've ever had in Britain in my lifetime, probably in everyone's lifetime, because Ben was never leader of the Labour Party, and Harold Wilson is a long way back and was in a different era. What did they do to him? They absolutely destroyed him.
Accept your half-hearted apology from the handling of the COVID pandemic. We saw ourselves the data coming out of China, out of North Italy, with lots of people dying a day. Can you just say something and just say sorry for all of the lives that were lost during the pandemic?
Yeah, I wasn't personally affected by this, but sorry for being a bit flippant when this question first came on, because lots of people will have lost loved ones in this situation. So it's easy for me to have moved on from it, which I have, but clearly this guy will have lost somebody, it sounds like, due to Boris Johnson's total incompetence as a Prime Minister, and poor decisions being made that he should have known were poor decisions at the time.
I mean, you weren't in government at the time, but you are here representing the former government.
Yeah, we're not talking about a report that is calling on me or the Conservative Party today to apologise for spending £350 billion to ensure that 4 million people remained employed throughout the pandemic. A rollout of a vaccine scheme which was probably the best, most well delivered in the world, by the way.
I mean, look, they only did that because capitalism was facing systemic failure during the pandemic. They had to do that. It wasn't novel in the UK that this sort of money was injected. Systemic crises of capitalism tend to be dealt with in this way. We saw it during the financial crisis as well. That the government was prepared to do unprecedented things to prop up the system. So I don't think they should get much credit for that.
We delivered that because we didn't have to follow EU rules. But I am not going to stick up for, and I've made it absolutely clear, I am not defending some of the things that went on in number 10, some of that culture which the report identifies. I do not defend any of that, but I wasn't part of it. I wasn't part of the Johnson government.
Joe, you've just fobbed that guy off in the audience who asked for an apology, and in doing so, you've fobbed off the whole country.
No, Josh.
A full
no,
apology.
Josh. What I've said, the worst thing that could come out of this
You've had your chance to speak. I'm going to continue. Not only have you fobbed off the guy who's just asked this question for an apology, you fobbed off the whole country who have been utterly let down by the way in which the Conservative government managed this situation. And it is laid bare in this report. Toxic sexist culture in number 10 Downing Street. I was out there vaccinating people against the pandemic. I trained up as a volunteer with St John Ambulance. My partner Connor was out in A&E working with people on ventilators to try to combat this. Key workers went out every single day in order to try to get our country through this. And we were utterly let down and undermined by the government at every turn. Boris Johnson should be hauled into Downing Street for one last Downing Street press conference to apologise to the whole country, and he should be banned from holding public office ever again in light of these failures that he's brought upon our country.
I don't think he should be banned from holding public office, but I did enjoy that. He's quite impressive, Josh Babarinde.
So throughout the whole of the pandemic, I worked for a national healthcare charity. I saw how bad it was. My sister is a nurse, and she worked throughout on the wards, actually just near where you are, Josh, throughout. And my father-in-law is a retired GP.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Does everyone have to say what they did during the pandemic? I was teaching online. It was much easier, I've got to say, than teaching in person.
I am fully aware of how difficult it was. The government at the time made key decisions about jobs, about locking down in good faith, using the advice of health professionals. Now, I accept in full the results of the inquiry. But if we're going to use this to blame Conservatives, when the report is very clear that Labour in Wales and the SNP in Scotland also got things wrong, then I think we're failing the future generations who need us to learn from the outcomes and implement the recommendations. So whoever's in government, and it might be, God forbid, because we don't want it ever to happen again, it might be a Labour government, they have learnt from this and are not looking to just score points against governments and prime ministers who are gone.
I don't think you can call it point scoring. I think that's really offensive to the people who suffered because of lack of government listening to advice and not shutting down early enough. The 25,000 people that could have been saved, that is not point scoring.
I've just been accused of fobbing a gentleman off. I'm not fobbing anyone off. As I said, I work for a national healthcare charity throughout COVID.
You've said, thank you.
That was quite nice, actually. This is what happens when you get like a sort of vaguely normal person on the panel who's just able to cut through the crap that they put forward. Just responding to the chat, I don't think anybody should be banned from holding public office. Maybe that's a controversial view. I believe in democracy. I believe we've got to trust people to vote into office who they want to. I think we should have a more democratic politics, not a less democratic politics, and that means proportional representation. It also means anybody can stand, however incompetent they might be.
Yes, woman here.
I do actually think that you should apologise because people did vote for you, and what you've just said about spending billions, like we should be grateful. It's hard-working taxpayers' money that you spent.
It wasn't. It was Bank of England money.
Without sort of real consultation. So I do think that people are owed an apology. And also during the pandemic, you were still allowing people to come in on aeroplanes right the way through, because I know people that came. So why didn't you shut that down? We do need.
They did shut the airports down.
An apology, I think.
Tell you what, listen, two people have asked you now if you want to apologise on behalf of the former government. Do you want to do that or not?
I'm not going to apologise on behalf of a government that I wasn't part of, but I'm not defending the mistakes that were identified. I'm not seeking to, I do not defend the culture in number 10 that the report identifies. All I ask for is that we ensure that the lessons are learned, and they're not just words, that we actually learn the lessons, and we make sure that our country and our healthcare system is more resilient if this should ever happen again, regardless.
Okay. You might know what I'm about to say, right? But the reason our healthcare system was not resilient was because of austerity. It wasn't just randomly not resilient. We were totally unprepared for a crisis of this scale because we had, and it wasn't just the Tories, it was a whole media ecosystem and a whole political consensus amongst the political establishment that said to us following the financial crisis that cuts were necessary and that we needed to balance the books. And as a consequence of that, necessary investment was either not done at all or was delayed, and it caused catastrophic long-term damage to the British economy. And we don't talk about this enough. We don't talk about austerity enough anymore, because unfortunately people now talk about Brexit, which was damaging as well. I would say not as damaging. You've kind of got a kind of liberal centrist that is just obsessed with Brexit. That's not me. I do think we need a closer trading relationship with the European Union, but by far and away the most destructive thing that's been done in Britain in my lifetime is austerity, and that's why we weren't prepared for the crisis.
Regardless of who is in power.
I'm not entirely sure that anyone really cares how good you were at the pandemic, how good you were at vaccinating, what you guys personally did during the pandemic. It's like bordering on a little bit egotistical here, when actually it's like, the thing about this inquiry is that, you know, it makes it sound like the only solution was to lock down harder and faster, completely ignoring the massive cost, not just 350 billion, which you're right, as if we should be thankful for it, was because you locked down for so long, was that you had to support people with so much money. This is completely losing sight of how damaging lockdown was for so many people.
Right, but lockdown, oh God, we've got a lockdown skeptic here, right? If you wanted shorter lockdowns during the pandemic, you had to do it earlier. But that isn't what the lockdown skeptics wanted. They wanted no lockdowns at all. You essentially had in Number 10 Downing Street, Boris Johnson, you had a lockdown skeptic. He didn't want to do it. He was forced to do it by events. And so in other words, Britain ended up doing lockdown as late as possible. And what that meant was that the peak was already high, and therefore we had a longer lockdown to bring it down. So we suffered for longer because he delayed and dithered about making a decision, because he was a libertarian, because he didn't want to do it. Now, you could be forgiving of him for having that particular political position, but let's not ignore reality. They had the Prime Minister they wanted in this crisis. They had a libertarian who didn't want a lockdown. And as a result, we had the outcome that we ended up with. We had a guy that was forced into making the decision. Now, of course, there were people that didn't want a lockdown at all. We don't know what would have happened had we not locked down at all, but all of the evidence tells us that what would have happened is that we would have had a National Health Service totally overwhelmed with cases, and we would have had far, far more deaths, and we might have got to the point where the NHS collapsed. That's why we had to lock down.
Young people, you know, it was a horrendous policy that went on for far, far too long. And the
it does also suggest, just reading it this afternoon, is that if some preventative measures, not lockdown, had been taken earlier, lockdowns might have been avoided altogether.
Yeah, the rule of 6 and all of that, which, you know, I have to say, the thing about Boris Johnson is, the only good thing about Boris Johnson was that he had just a tiny smidgen that lasted for about 3 seconds of a bit of a sense of sort of liberty and civil liberties in him, which I think was just positive for a minute, because I think he understood the consequences of what would happen if you shut down society.
And that's what made it worse, the fact that he didn't do it soon enough. These people haven't learned, have they, from what happened? They haven't reflected at all.
And the fact that the government was initially sort of nervous about doing that was, if it wasn't positive, it was important, because I think what's happened with this inquiry is we've lost complete sight of the damages that lockdown brought, and the damages that...
Everybody would be nervous about making that decision. I would be nervous. You don't have to be a libertarian to reflect seriously about the consequences of locking down a whole country. But we had the evidence from Italy, we had it from the Far East, we knew what was coming. We knew that as soon as COVID came here, it would be exponential growth. We knew it was inevitable that it would come here. We understood when we had one case that we probably had hundreds. And we could have taken measures sooner to make the... Because the thing is, if you're a libertarian, the logic works like this, right? If you want fewer measures, you actually have to act sooner, right? That's the whole point. I've made that point already, but it's winding me up.
are still being reaped, whether it's, we've had discussions, we're endlessly having discussions about mental health. Rachel Reeves in her sort of discussions about the budget keeps dropping the P word, pandemic, for how much of a problem it was. If we come out of this inquiry thinking that the only solution to any future pandemic is to shut down society instantly, then we have failed, because we're not recognising the consequences of that action. And
I mean, that's literally what you have to do to prevent contagion, isn't it?
the inquiry itself refused to take on board any cost-benefit analysis of what happened with lockdown. We still don't have answers to that. And it's a balancing act, isn't it? Nobody wants people to die, and that's a very serious thing to take into consideration. What measures do you take with that? I also don't think, do any of us sit here want to see lockdown happen again and have people kept from work and have people, in misery at home, have the kind of costs that are related to that? Do you? Surely you don't. So, coming out of this and taking on board from this inquiry the idea that lockdown was just a really great thing that should have happened.
Nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks lockdown was a great thing. Literally nobody thinks that. Nobody wanted lockdown. The two positions that you had were people who didn't think lockdown was necessary at all, which doesn't seem to be her view. What she's saying is, well, maybe it is her view, in which case, what do you do when the NHS becomes overwhelmed with patients? You can't have shorter lockdowns without doing the lockdown earlier. So her whole position is contradictory and doesn't make sense. She likes the fact that Johnson resisted the urge to lock down sooner, and that's what caused more deaths than were necessary, because it resulted in a bigger curve, and it meant that we were in lockdown for longer. That's the failure. And it wasn't difficult for him to understand, because we had the evidence from abroad. I was part of a school community. I was the trade union rep. I had lots of misgivings about our head. I was working in a big private school, if people want to criticise me from the left. I did unionise the school and got massive pay rises for a group of women by threatening strike action. But anyway, I had massive problems with the head, but one of the things he did is he shut the school before the government did, because he understood what we all did, that this was inevitable. So it wasn't just that I was critical of government at the time. I was part of an institution, this school, that had actually made the decision before the government did, because the school leadership that I was in the school I was at understood things better than the government did. And loads of people were like that. Loads of people were walking around thinking, this is mad that people are still in bars, that people are still going to Cheltenham, that people are still mixing so closely. So, I hope when the history is written on this, the reality is acknowledged, that loads and loads of ordinary people were thinking that the government's policy was mad and were shouting at the television, as I was.
Quicker and sooner and faster is nonsense, and it's not at all what the public think, by the way.
Well, let's hear what's on the public think. One here in the front.
The report highlighted today that there were sections of our society that were disproportionately affected by COVID, namely those that are the most low paid, and also black and ethnic minority communities as well were disproportionately affected by COVID. And that's come out in the report today, that you've said that you accept in its full entirety. So therefore, was that toxic culture within 10 Downing Street perpetuating inequalities within society? This report says so.
Let me get round a few more people first. Yes, woman next to you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where the compassion is in this room tonight, really. We're looking at 25,000 lives that could have been
23,000.
23,000.
Some people question the modelling, but that's the modelling that the...
I mean, austerity is modelled to have killed, I think it's like 300,000 people. So just to put things in proportion here, I mean, lots of people actually died because of the effects of this virus. And perhaps that would have happened, well, it would have happened under any government, but it was made worse by the policies of the Conservative government. But austerity was a political choice, and the excess deaths caused by austerity, according to the Lancet, were hundreds of thousands of people. So again, there's no public inquiry about that, is there?
Thousands of lives that could have been saved. People are still grieving over that, and we have a brag list of how much spending was done during the pandemic. No. I think it's all wrong.
I'll come back to you. I'll just hear some more people. Yes, man in the check shirt with the glasses. Yeah.
And just whilst we're on austerity, there's also long-term effects of austerity, right? So reduced living standards, reduced life expectancy, things like that. And it's difficult to study these things, isn't it? But if you fail to invest, it has these long-term impacts. I think I've seen data, I don't know if it's Britain, it's certainly true in the United States, that our life expectancy increase that sort of existed for a very long time has started to stall. The political choices our leaders make to deprioritize the needs and concerns of ordinary people have consequences, and those can be quantified. And again, I think austerity led to more painful consequences than almost anything we've witnessed in my lifetime.
As it's been mentioned that the hindsight is a wonderful thing, but at the same time, what we should learn from this report is the fact that it's been reported correctly and lessons learned is also been mentioned. Boris, for all his faults, one thing he did push through was the vaccine, because he's never been a detail man.
It was a gamble. It was a gamble. Paid off. Is that what we want in our political leaders?
He couldn't control those kind of details. So I'm glad that the lessons learned are carried on. Although the pandemic is every 100 years or whatever they say, these are written down and logged for future if ever happens.
Man in the black top.
It will happen again.
I think trying to beg for an apology from the gentleman up there, it serves any purpose whatsoever. That's been and gone. I think as an electorate, it's our responsibility to appoint people who are far more competent at handling themselves and crises than the gross negligence and incompetence that has gone before, with people like Johnson, Sunak, Dominic Raab, all those muppets. Just a waste of time. They wouldn't be in any company worth their weight. And that's the thing as an electorate we need to learn, to appoint better quality people with bigger, better ideas.
The thing I disagree with this guy about is people think something. It's something. I've had too much wine. It's something people tend to say that they wouldn't make it in any company worth its weight. But my experience working, I've only ever worked in schools, right? But the people who rise up the ranks within the institutions I've worked for haven't been the most competent people. They've tended to be the people that have been most willing to go along with what the higher-ups tell them to do, to climb the greasy pole. I don't know whether that is something that's unique to Britain, but the idea that we have these sort of really talented people within businesses rising up the corporate ladders is bollocks. It's not true, in my experience. I don't know what other people think, but capitalism doesn't reward people for being competent. It rewards people for being, I don't know, since I've had a bit of wine, it rewards people for being a slimy fucker. It rewards people for being a toady to the management, really, and being willing to do things on that basis. So I'm not convinced that those that succeed in business are those that are the best. I just think they're the most sort of, in my experience, just the people who are willing to do whatever it takes in this sort of dog-eat-dog system that we have under neoliberal capitalism. Those that won't do that, me, become the union rep, cause trouble in the workplace, and end up working for a trade union instead.
Right, well, we haven't heard from you, Stephen, yet.
Yeah, I do think, I think to the lady's point down the front here, we should take a moment just to reflect on the tragedy of COVID and the number of people who lost their lives and families who've been bereaved. And I think it's just heartbreaking, and these reports come out and I think it just reminds us of that time and how difficult it was. And I think it's also the trauma. I think the country is still traumatized in many, many ways. Deep scars left, particularly on our young people, I think. So young people who should be out there socializing with their friends, people who maybe are at university who couldn't go. And those are deep scars that we need to get over. So I think we just need to reflect on that as a country, and I think it's an opportunity for us to also come together and reflect on that. Lessons learned. I mean, there's one deep lesson for me, which is the damage that austerity did to our public services.
Yes, that is true. However, the Labour Party at the time supported austerity. So this is an interesting point that's being made by Labour. And of course, the budget that is coming up is still embracing fundamentally a logic that comes from austerity, that you need to balance the books and that you need to be, you need to worry about the bond markets, that you need to worry about these minor fluctuations in the OBR's assessment of how much borrowing you might have to do. All of this is not a good way of running the economy. What you need to try and do is to work out what spending is needed for the economy and for society, do that spending, and then to tax as much as is needed for social purposes and to control inflation.
Our health and care workers were amazing. Everybody remembers standing on the doorsteps and applauding them, and what heroes.
I never banged my pan. I never did it. I never did it. I thought that it was ridiculous at the time. I was a teacher at the time. I didn't regard it as being in any way, I don't know, I didn't get into that at all. I just thought it was a silly bit of political posturing. And of course we realised that quite soon after the pandemic was over. Everyone was banging their pans in favour of public servants, and then of course we all had to go on strike to make sure that our pay kept up with inflation, right? So people had pretty short memories.
They were, but our public services had been left very vulnerable and exposed, so that when something big came along like COVID, we were lacking in resilience. So there's a big lesson here to learn, which is why I think it's really important, you know, that the Chancellor has said one thing we won't be doing in this government is having a return to austerity. We've got to rebuild our public services, not just for the business as usual as delivering for our people, but also to be ready for this kind of crisis coming that could come down the track. And finally, just on lessons learned, we are, as a government, we ran a cross-departmental pandemic preparedness exercise in the autumn, and a report and a strategy is now being drafted, which will be published next year, to set out how we, as a government, but as a nation, should ensure that we are ready for the eventuality that we might have another pandemic. So we absolutely are using these inquiries as an opportunity to learn lessons and to be prepared for the future.
Let's just be clear about this. Nobody should listen to the Labour Party on austerity. Even under Gordon Brown, the plan was to do austerity, but to do it slightly slower and to balance it so that there was tax rises more than there was cuts in spending. So austerity would have happened under a Labour government. To her credit, before the election, I said that austerity was going to happen under a Labour government, and Rachel Reeves increased taxes massively after the election. Unfortunately, she'd constrained herself, so the wrong tax went up, and the Tories are right to call it a jobs tax. Employer national insurance contributions are not the tax to put up if you care about making sure that working people have jobs. But they ring-fenced themselves in so that they felt that they had to put up that particular tax. It would have been much better if during the general election they'd made an argument for what they intended to do, to give themselves the political space that they would certainly have had if they'd made that argument to put up other taxes. My preference would be corporation tax, because it's a tax on profits. It doesn't discourage jobs. Of course, it only comes out of profits that are made. And so, you know, it's not something that punishes businesses that are perhaps not as profitable or not profitable at all. So that's where I would have taxed. But the Labour Party committed not to put up that tax either. They really hemmed themselves in, really stupid. And they're still doing austerity because whenever you hem yourself in with a set of fiscal rules like this, like the rule, for example, Rachel Reeves has got to have debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the Parliament. That's such an arbitrary rule to impose. And the only reason that she's doing that is because she's scared of the markets, and there's no reason to be scared of the markets. The government should plough ahead.
Up on the lessons learned.
Very quickly, so otherwise I'm not going to fit in another
The
question.
gentleman made a really good point about the vaccine. Absolutely, the speed of that being a great success. And the lesson that we've got to learn for the future is that we've got to continue to invest in that kind of research so that going forward we are even more prepared for whatever it might be.
All right.
Nigel Farage has platformed people who have questioned the vaccines, who have undermined that kind of research. That's a lesson we've got to learn for the future. We have to keep the likes of Farage away from this going forward. Otherwise, more people's lives could be at risk.
All right, I'm sure if Reform were on the panel, they would defend themselves. They're not here to do so, but we hear what you say. Okay.
We heard what the guy said.
Well,
he said that the royal family was potentially had cancer because they'd taken a COVID vaccine.
No, I get that. And as you know, Reform he was a keynote speaker. They have distanced themselves from him subsequently. Right, I was going to...
Well, I like the fact that Farage has criticised the royal family, to be honest. The royal family, people complain about benefit scroungers, don't they? But the royal family live off the rest of us, don't they? And the land that they stole from us over generations of war and conquest. So I think we should get rid of the royal family and the rest of the aristocracy who live off land that was bequeathed to them ultimately through violence and through the brutal suppression of ordinary working people who tried to resist them over centuries. It's a disgrace that we still have a royal family. And yeah, I'm dead against it.
Try and fit in 4 questions. I can manifestly fail because I'm only going to get to one more. So let's hear from Alex White.
Inflation eases, yet families feel poorer. Are government policies actually working for us?
Alex, do you feel they're working for you?
Yes and no. I think every time you go to the supermarket, prices are higher, petrol is more expensive, yet the statistics tell a different story. I'm not really sure who to believe.
Well, the thing is, it's hitting people disproportionately. So I'm a homeowner, and that puts me in a relatively comfortable position. The only reason I am is because I lost both of my parents when I was in my 20s, and so I inherited some money, not a lot. I grew up in the north of England, so we sold the family home and we split it between me and my brother. And that meant that both of us were able to get on the property ladder in tragic circumstances, but it reveals something about the nature of our society, doesn't it? That we live in an inheritocracy, that unless you are either in terrible circumstances like I was in when I was growing up, in which case you can afford to get on the housing ladder early, or you're kind of waiting for your parents to die to inherit money, in which case our lot in life is not determined by what we do as individuals to try and further ourselves, but it is a consequence of what we inherit from our parents. And that's the unfortunate reality of the situation we find ourselves in. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the current cost of living crisis doesn't affect me as much as it might other people. My mortgage payments are... I'm currently on a mortgage holiday, actually, because I spent a lot of time working in a boarding house, and so I didn't pay any rent for a while. And didn't have to pay my mortgage. I had to pay my mortgage, but I was renting I was a landlord, right? But to defend myself, I didn't want to be a landlord so much that I rented my house out to the school, because I didn't want to be a landlord to individuals. I wanted to be a landlord to a private organisation that could afford whatever. And they screwed me, actually. They gave me such a bad rent. I didn't negotiate at all. I'm against landlordism. But my point is, if you're living on rental income, let's say you're living in London, the average rent in London is £2,800. So how are you going to afford to live? As somebody that is a property owner, I think house prices need to come down. There has to be a hit to people who own houses. And if you view housing as somewhere to live, which I do, this is my house. I will only ever own one house. The only reason I was ever a landlord is because I was living in a boarding house, and so weirdly I had a house that was just going to sit vacant otherwise, which is an unusual situation to be in. I don't believe in owning more than one property. I don't believe housing is an asset. So a house price crash would only ever affect you really badly if you had multiple properties, right? Because the whole market will collapse, and then you could just move. You should just be able to move to another house that you can live in. So we need to have rent controls, and we need to have a policy that's going to gradually cool the housing market. I think that's the big issue, because as things are presently, you've just got this huge divide in our society between those who are homeowners and those who rent, and that's unacceptable. And I think the Green Party are in a good place with this by seeking to tax things like second homes and make it more difficult for landlords.
Well, obviously, inflation falling doesn't mean...
Oh, yeah, and by the way, Lloyd Russell-Moyle, yes, somebody asked me in the chat earlier, Lloyd Russell-Moyle was a landlord. I don't know in what circumstances he was a landlord, but he certainly was. I know him really well, and he's a good person, and he's a committed socialist, and he was actually very strong in Parliament on renters reform and on rent controls. So if it means anything, I trust him, and he's certainly got my endorsement.
That prices aren't going up just means they're going up more slowly, and food inflation is at something like 4.9%. So inflation eases, yet families feel poorer. Are government policies actually helping us, Ella?
No, and the thing about, the Chancellor and anyone else in government sort of taking their temperature check of the economy on the basis of these announcements, it's like listening to a weather report at the moment. You just don't know what's going to happen. There's a sense that Reeves is sort of constantly waiting for some missive from the godlike Office for Budget Responsibility to give her politics. There's no sense of any sort of genuine plan beyond tweaking a little bit of tax here, U-turning, then U-turning on the U-turn when it comes to the income tax. I mean, it would be laughable if this wasn't such a serious issue for people. And there's a sort of, a tick that the government keeps falling on of sort of, the fault is Brexit, or the fault is Tory austerity, or the fault is the pandemic. And, there are the issues with the British productivity crisis go decades into the past, and there are lots of things you can point to. Fine, what is the solution? And I think the government has, it needs to be very honest with the problem with public spending, overspending, the fact that we're paying, what is it, 110 billion on just interest alone on national debt, and no willingness to say what the hard solutions might be.
And what do you think the hard solutions could be?
Well, the one hard solution, which actually would be quite popular with the public, I think, is to just completely let go and cut all the net zero promises, which would save 10 billion. Tomorrow you could do it. I don't know what stranglehold Ed Miliband...
I mean, this is what you end up with this sort of austerity logic, that you end up suggesting cuts that aren't necessary. As I said earlier, you've got to start from thinking about what is it necessary for the state to do, and then build your politics around that. If you start from the idea that there's a finite amount of money that you can spend, it's just the wrong way of thinking about the economy. Essentially how the economy works is that we have a set of resources that can be deployed either by private individuals for their own uses, by private businesses, or by the government. And so what the government is doing by creating money and putting it into the economy, which is the only way that money enters the economy, is that it is deciding that certain resources are going to be used for the public good. And what's left over will be used for either private individuals for their consumption or for private industry. And this is the reason why inequality is a problem, because what happens if you've got a very unequal society, if you've got billionaires within the society, is that they monopolize the scarce resources themselves, and that has an impoverishing effect on the public realm, because the fundamental economic problem is that we have scarce resources. There's only so much to go around. Of course, you can grow the economy, but if you have millionaires and billionaires, they're going to be monopolizing more of the resources for themselves. And that's part of the job of the government, to make sure that doesn't happen by taxing them, by spending the money on things that we all need as a society. And all of that should be obvious, but unfortunately, very few people in the public domain argue for it. What do I think of Bank of England independence? I've been asked in the chat. I'm against it. I think it's ideological. The way that the Bank of England is set up is to punitively increase interest rates in the face of any type of inflation, whether that's demand side or supply side. It makes sense to increase interest rate when you have a demand side inflation, because the idea is that increasing interest rates will mean that those who might spend their money will instead put their money into savings and won't spend it, and that will have a cooling effect on the economy and therefore bring down inflation. But instead, you've also got the Bank of England using increased interest rate rises when there's supply side inflation. And that operates in a very different way. Supply side inflation, there's very little you can do if you're importing inflation from an oil price increase, for example. We saw that in the 1970s when we had a stagflation situation. The same was true more recently with the inflation caused partly by an increase in the oil price, partly by the war in Ukraine. Interest rate rises are much less effective in those circumstances, and all they do is punish ordinary people by increasing their mortgages, by increasing the cost of borrowing. So yeah, I would get rid of the Bank of England being independent. I think the independence of the Bank of England makes interest rate policy seem apolitical when actually it is deeply political.
And has on your party, but it's certainly not popular.
Well, the alternative is that the Chancellor sets the interest rate, as used to be the case until Gordon Brown changed it.
Outside of Parliament, and it's costing lots and lots of money. It's costing issues in business. High energy costs are the number one issue for everyone, businesses, people at home. Do something about that. Do something about the fact that the welfare bill is just out of control. You need to have some hard arguments around.
Britain's welfare bill is one of the lowest in Europe.
Tightening up criteria around that, and focus spending where it needs to go, whether it's social care, whether it's investment. But you can't just keep going along.
There's no way this woman is in favour of putting more money into social care. Like, that is not her politics, is it? What we need is a national care service. We need to nationalise the care sector. We need to prioritise it. We need to invest in it. And it needs to be a central government priority, because at the moment, things like the care budget, which are mandatory for councils to spend money on, are putting councils in a position where they have to deliver social care, and so it's eating up more and more and more of local council budgets. And that means that when we elect local councillors to make change happen within our communities, it's not possible, because so much of the money is spent on central government priorities by local authorities.
This sort of line of things are a little bit bad, but they'll be okay if we just manage it in this sort of very technocratic way. We need a big vision for the economy, some hard arguments, and some kind of mettle, some confidence from a government that has a plan. This government, the last government certainly didn't have it. This government doesn't have it. So the future is bleak. I mean, it's like terrible to have to sit there and say this, but things aren't going to get better anytime soon unless we have a change of people in charge.
That's true, but I would suggest that her black shirt is suggesting the direction she wants to go in, and it's not the direction I want to go in.
Families feel poorer. Are government policies actually helping us?
I don't think so. If families are still feeling poor, and they genuinely are, then at the moment, no, the government policies aren't helping us. And I agree with Ella. I think, this pre-budget, work in progress that we've been exposed to over the last few weeks of sort of throwing in a few policies here and there to see how they sort of land. And they're like that one? No, OK, I'll take that one back again.
With the media as well, not with the public, with the media.
But it doesn't instill an awful lot of confidence in the forthcoming budget.
Feeling a bit bad about that black shirt comment. I don't mean to say she's a fascist. I just mean to say that she's on the right politically. Just be clear.
I mean, there's a lot of talk in the media as well at the moment about people, on £100,000 a year feeling poor, and that sort of shift in wage thing. And if you've got to be earning this much to feel like you're actually getting ahead, I think there's such a massive gap now between the rich and poor in this country that if you are genuinely on lower wages and inflation is hitting you that hard with food and stuff, it's really bloody hard to survive. And there are people in this country working full time who are using food banks. That should never happen. That should never happen.
I mean, the audience are all clapping, right? But what would be necessary to make sure that doesn't happen is that they elect very different governments to what they seem to want to elect.
Yes, man with the glass and the blue sweater.
So just with regards to the idea that net zero is cutting that is going to reduce energy prices, right now the most expensive component of our energy prices is the fact that we use natural gas. So renewable power is cheaper to generate than gas energy. How do you square those two things? It just doesn't make sense.
Man in the grey sweatshirt.
Good evening. Just running with the idea of cutting net zero targets, as you just said, I'd just be interested what the rest of the panel's opinion would be on that, and or do you have any other radical ideas?
All right, I'll get round the panel in a minute. Yes, Guy.
I mean, this just hints at a fundamental issue again, right? That if we're going to move to a sustainable economy, which of course we should for all sorts of reasons, we need massive public investment. It can't be the case that I have to pay God knows how much money for a heat pump for my own home. It can't be the case. The government needs to invest in these things. It needs to subsidise these things. This is another example of necessary investment that needs to happen. And it shouldn't fall on the shoulders of ordinary people to be making those changes.
Yeah, I think you've got a cricket sweater on. Yes, you.
I believe just the establishment parties need to stop being so spineless with, not implementing radical changes. They seem content with seeing our managed decline, and as was raised previously, there needs to be bold action and quickly, and I do believe the establishment needs to go. There needs to be a whole fresh group of people in charge.
Like who?
Well, personally, I lean towards reform, but even then...
This is a really interesting thing, right? I was nodding along with this guy until he said that. It's really interesting the extent to which the analysis that reform have of what's gone wrong in our politics is really quite similar to what people say on the left. Everything he said up until the point of saying he supported reform was correct. There has been a failure of politics, and that's been created by a political system that creates a two-party system where you have a system that just means that you've got a transfer of power between Labour and the Tories constantly, and that's the only political choice you have. That is a problem. The answer isn't reform, and the answer isn't reform for quite a specific reason that is non-ideological, actually. Reform are an establishment party. Nigel Farage went to Dulwich College, private school. He was a Tory up until the point of the Maastricht Treaty being passed by John Major's government in the 1990s. He only left for that reason. He remained committed to Tory principles. He idolised Thatcher. He idolised Enoch Powell. He's basically a Tory that is upset with the Conservative Party for entering the European Union. You'd probably describe him as a Powellite or a Thatcherite. He's on the right of the Tory party, but he remains a Tory. And his whole story, really, apart from the fact that he set up a odd political party, he helped set up an odd political party, UKIP. He is a pillar of the establishment. He believes in neoliberalism. He wants to cut spending. He wants to reduce taxes, just the way the Tories do. He's a Tory through and through, really. But he presents as a maverick because of the political journey he's been on. And the other thing I'd say about Farage that I haven't said so far this stream is that we know the sort of guy that he is. You can judge politicians, I think, by how they behave in office. What do they do? Do they go into office for the right reasons to push forward the interest of the people they represent? Or do they go into office for self-serving reasons? One of the things we know about Farage is that when he was an MEP, he claimed £2 million worth of taxpayers' money over his time in the European Parliament. He's got a really generous pension from the European Union, even though it's an institution he doesn't support. And not only did he pay his wife to work for him out of money from taxpayers, he also paid his mistress to work for him. This is a guy that criticised the European Union gravy train, but he absolutely benefited from that gravy train to the tune of millions. And he continues to be the sort of guy that is willing to do and say anything for cash. He neglects his constituents because he's not interested in representing them. He does GB News. He does interviews for Russia Today and other outlets. He makes these weird videos that you can pay for him to wish you a happy birthday and what have you, and makes loads of money from that. It strikes me that this is a self-serving individual. I didn't particularly like George Washington as a character in lots of ways, not least of which because he was a slave owner. But one of the things I've always admired about him as a political leader is two things, really. He led the United States during their War of Independence and then handed back his commission so that he wouldn't become a dictator, and then sort of reluctantly accepted the presidency. And then after serving 2 terms, he refused to continue in office, right? That's what we want from leaders. The best political leaders are those that least want to have power. And unfortunately, Farage is not that. And we know that he's not that because we've got evidence. The receipts are in, right?
I'm sure there are people in the Greens who would be able to bring radical change. I just think there has to be change of some capacity.
I mean,
that is so interesting, right? Because prior to that, he said reform. This is a really interesting category of young voter, and we can see it in the polling data, right? If you look at some of these focal data polls, the Greens come first amongst young people, but after that, it is reform now. And I think you've got a group of young people that really buy into the political analysis that our political system has failed, but they are, particularly men, much less so women, they are open to the arguments from the right. And we've got to engage with them to try and persuade them towards our point of view, I think.
Two very different types of party. You think one or the other?
But isn't that interesting that you're holding those both in the same...
Fiona Bruce has got no idea why somebody would have that view. It's perfectly obvious why somebody would have that view. It's a failure of her political analysis, really, which really undermines her as a journalist if she doesn't understand what's going on and makes her look very distant from how ordinary people are thinking and feeling about politics, the fact that came out of her mouth. It's really easy to understand why somebody would have that view.
Conversation, the same sentence.
It is... My main quarrel is that the establishment are failing, like, across the board. This country is just going down and down and down. It keeps declining and declining and declining, and the main parties seem just sort of content with that.
All right, well, let's put it to them, shall we?
I'd love to interview that guy. He's so emblematic of what is happening in this country.
Spineless, I think, was the word that was used, Stephen.
That was one of the words, yes. I have been called worse, I suppose. Look, we are really pleased that we've seen inflation coming down a bit. There's still a long way to go. What I hope is that will then lead to the next time the Bank of England sets interest rates cuts, we'll get another cut to interest rates. That will be the 6th since we won the general election in July 2024. Cuts to interest rates are great news in terms of helping people with the cost of living. Other measures, 30...
I mean, they help people who have mortgages the most, whether the economy is structured, and those tend to be people in more privileged positions, but okay, I take the point.
Hours of free childcare a week, that's going to help to the tune of £7,500 a year. We've got the warm homes
Nursery fees
discount.
are going up. That's a nonsense. Nursery fees are going up. It's not making a difference to people.
I don't know how you square 30 hours of free childcare with what you've just said, but okay.
Because nursery fees are going up, Steve.
I'm sure Fact Checker can look at that.
They can.
Warm homes discount.
I think she's right, actually. I mean, it's really difficult for families to afford childcare, and it's an impediment on the economy that shouldn't exist. The government need to do more on that.
£150 off people's energy. The two big drivers of inflation are food and energy, and the energy question has come up. Now, on that, it's absolutely right to say that the biggest part of the energy cost is because our energy wholesale market is pegged to gas. And the way to get off gas is to get onto renewables, get Putin's boot off our necks, and stop being on the roller coaster of carbon costs, which is what gas is all about. And on food, let's get a better Brexit deal.
But they were going to do this, if you remember, they had this big package of policies they were going to do as part of GB Energy. They were going to invest tens of billions of pounds into the sort of change that we might have needed, and they rolled back on all of that. The radical policy that they had, it was part of this gradual shift to the right by Keir Starmer. They've largely abandoned, as far as I can see. So I'm not sure where this huge transformation is coming from. It is great that Ed Miliband is still there, because he is... I've got a lot of time for Ed, to be fair. He's probably the most left-wing person they've got in the cabinet, and he's pushing forward his agenda as Energy Secretary. But the money hasn't been there, has it, in the way that it was promised?
That we can reduce food costs, because so much of the inflation in food costs is from the totally botched Brexit deal, which ended up with massive import costs.
Forgive me for interrupting. And of course, I only know what people are going to say who put their hands up. There's lots of people who don't put their hands up. Maybe they're sitting there week after week thinking, this government is going great, and we all feel so much better off. But I've got to say that week after week, that's not the message we're hearing. And we hear people sit in the government, and you're...
I mean, look at the polling, Fiona.
Sitting here in this seat this week, it's others other weeks, and they list all sorts of things like the breakfast clubs and more GP appointments, what have you. But this keeps coming up again and again when we ask our audience to submit questions. They're not feeling better off.
Because we've got a government that is trying to be New Labour in totally different social and historical circumstances. And New Labour wasn't even enough for the circumstances they found themselves in. So if you remember, if you go back to 1997, the Labour Party back then had constrained themselves in office by making commitments not to put up taxes and to stick to Tory spending plans. And it was disastrous. Tony Blair came under a huge amount of pressure between 1997 and 2001 to do something about the fact that the NHS was not getting better under his stewardship. And then, of course, after the next election, Gordon Brown put up taxes to fund the National Health Service, and that turned things around. But we're in a much worse position now, because back then the economy was growing, so you could use the proceeds of growth to help to fund public services. You know, the Labour Party in many ways didn't make massive changes, but the changes they did make were possible because of the circumstances they found themselves in. We're not in those circumstances anymore. We've got a productivity crisis in Britain. The big stat I like to use is to use my own life as a sort of barometer of what's gone wrong in Britain. In the first 20 years of my life, between 1985 and 2005, real wages went up by, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but it's something like 56%. In the second half of my life, it was something like 3%. In other words, real wages were basically flat in the second half of my life because there was a failure for the economy more generally. So there's a real problem there that for anybody in around about my generation, so I'm a geriatric millennial, anybody age 40 or younger, they've grew up in a generation where potentially when they entered the labour market, it was difficult to get a job because of the financial crisis. And then even when they did get a job, the kind of progression that they would have expected to make with their wages and with their living conditions hasn't happened because real wages have been basically flat. And not only that, but we've had a weakened bargaining position because trade unions have not been strong and not been assertive enough. And that's only just beginning to change. So if you're on the channel and you're thinking of doing something about it, join a trade union and organise your workplace, because that's one way of solving this. But really, yeah, you know, things are bad and continuing to be bad unless you have radical policies to change things.
Result of this government?
Well, We were elected on a manifesto front page said change, and change takes time to deliver, particularly when you inherit the bin fire that we inherited from the previous
Hatley did it in one parliament.
Administration. That change is not going to come overnight. Now, the policies are in place, the legislation is in place, but that takes time to filter through into people's lives so they actually feel it in their pockets, in their day-to-day lives, seeing our public services getting fixed. Yes, the NHS waiting lists are coming down. People aren't feeling that. Yes.
What's the vision? What's the vision? Because if it's just technocratic managerialism, it's not enough. People don't want a better manager. They want a vision of what the future of our society is going to look like, and you're not providing that.
There are 2,500 more GPs on the front line thanks to what we've done. People will start to feel that with better access to their GP surgery and better patient experiences. All of that takes time to be felt in the day-to-day life and reality that people are experiencing. I completely understand that. Frustration is there, and I understand why people are frustrated, but we don't have a magic wand. Change takes time to deliver, particularly given the depth of the hole that we had to dig ourselves out of.
What's your response to that?
Well, to go back to Alex's question, are the government's policies helping? No. If we go back to the budget last year, the Chancellor broke her manifesto and raised taxes. But what she did say at that time is that that's wiped the slate clean. That was her words. And she said after that budget, it's on us now. Right? She blamed the previous government for that budget. She's on us now. What she's going to come back and do next week is come back for more. She's got a 30 billion black hole that the OBR says she needs to close off. So she's going to come back for more. And what people are telling me up and down the country, particularly on the Isle of Wight, where I represent the East Wight, is they're terrified if they're running a small business that it's going to be more expensive to employ people. We've seen in the last year that 180,000 people have come off payroll. And if you make it more expensive to employ people, fewer people will be employed, and you will get more pressure for people to go on.
Tax big business then. Increase top corporation tax for big businesses. And then you could use that to cut national insurance contributions. These problems aren't difficult to solve if the government wants to solve them.
The welfare, on welfare benefits. There is a different way of doing this. There is a different way of endlessly increasing taxes, and that is to reduce spending on things like welfare. If the Chancellor can take that back to pre-pandemic levels, she will save £23 billion. If she can cut the civil service back to where it was in 2016, she'll save another £8 billion. That would deliver what the OBR says she needs to find. There is another route. So if she raises taxes, as the Chancellor said last year, it's on her. This is her choices.
Josh.
I mean, I don't know who that is supposed to appeal to. So what are our choices? We can punish poor people, or we can cut the capacity of the state to deliver things that we all need. The civil service is a mess at the moment. The British state seems to be incapable of delivering anything. The idea that the British state is functioning perfectly fine and we can just afford to cut thousands of civil service jobs as if they're not needed, ridiculous. And it's the sort of lazy politics that you get where you just argue that there's lots of waste that you can have, that there's lots of low hanging fruit. I don't think we need to do these cuts at all, frankly. The government needs to start from a good place and invest in what needs to be invested in, and worry less about short-term fluctuations in the OBR's assessment, as I've said before.
I want to take you to Eastbourne, my hometown where I'm the MP. Some of you will know it as the sunniest town in the country, officially. It's also been the site of the busiest food bank in the country. More food parcels distributed per head in Eastbourne than anywhere else up until a couple of years ago. These are people who have been driven to poverty for some time. They've been kept in that poverty by the likes of the two-child benefit cap that this government has failed to remove. They've been kept in poverty by the changes to the winter fuel allowance. It's been cut from so many pensioners who need it. And they've been driven into poverty as a result of jobs being cut and limited because of the government's jobs tax.
It's mostly the two-child benefit thing that's driven children into poverty. So if they reversed that, they would remove around about 500,000 children out of poverty overnight. And they're a Labour government and they've failed to do that. The other things he listed are, I think, less significant. But I do think they should reverse the increase to employer national insurance contributions and tax in a better way. The reason they can't do that is because they box themselves in at the general election, and that's a political decision they made. But it's a bad tax to raise.
Alex's question, is this government's policy doing the right thing to support people with the cost of living? Absolutely not. And I agree with the gentleman when he says that we need some radical solutions, and Liberal Democrats have been offering those. Fundamentally, we need to cut bills for people. And our plan involves taxing some of the big dogs in our society to support those who are struggling most. That's the likes of the big tech giants who are causing all sorts of problems in our society, increasing the digital services tax to help people who are struggling. That involves putting a tax on the windfall that big banks are making to help bring bills down. The list goes on. There are people...
The list doesn't go on. But it's interesting to see the Liberal Democrats being perhaps a little bit more radical than they otherwise would be, perhaps responding to the Green Party's radicalism by moving to the left. That's good to see. Just responding to a question in the chat, my thoughts on the triple lock is that the triple lock needs to go, I think. It's helped to reduce pensioner poverty, and that should be a concern for all of us. But it means that over time, if it doesn't go, it's going to soak up more and more of the state's limited resources within the context of neoliberalism, right? Whilst we remain in a discourse where people say that there's a limited amount of money to go around, it's not helpful politically for there to be a triple lock, because that ends up taking up more of the capacity of the state, and I think there are better uses for that money. So I would probably I'd link pensions to either inflation or average earnings. I'd pick one, and I'd put that in place. But the triple lock is too much, because it just means that the cost of the state pension goes up and up and up over time, and it creates an imbalance in our society between young and old.
With the cash in our society, big organisations that need to be paying their way. For too long, they've been allowed to make cash off the backs of those struggling most, and we need to break that and turn that on its head.
I'm afraid to say that we are pretty much out of time. I know lots of you got your hands up, so I'm so sorry I'm not getting round more of you. But listen, thank you very much to the panel for coming along this evening. Thank you to all of you for putting your questions.
Okay, so that's the end of question time. I'll stay online for a bit, I think. I'm a little bit drunk because I've had most of a bottle of wine now. I don't normally drink when I'm doing a stream, but I'm off work next week, so I'm not working tomorrow. Got given an extra day's holiday by our General Secretary, and I'm using it tomorrow to have a day off. So I'm not working tomorrow, and I'm using it actually as an opportunity to go to the press conference tomorrow with Lloyd Russell-Moyle and Zach Polansky, and there's going to be an after party as well, celebrating the fact that a Labour MP has crossed the floor. So what I think I might do actually is there was an interview that was done by Lloyd Russell-Moyle. Let's see if I can find it. So I think we might watch that. If people want to hang around, if you don't, that's fine. Getting a bit late, isn't it? Here we go. Already started to watch it later, so I will start watching it again. Watch this, then I can go to bed. I tend to go to bed really late, so it might be that I stay up really late with you guys. If you got people, if there's people in the chat that stay up really late as well, then I might stay on for a bit longer. Let's see how we go.
I think after a while you realise if you have that unhealthy political culture in your own party, you export that unhealthy political culture into the wider politics when you govern.
Do you think Morgan McSweeney is a dangerous force in the Labour Party?
He is clearly one of them. Hello, my name is Lloyd Russell-Moyle, and I, for 7 years, was the Member of Parliament for Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven. And today I'm joined the Green Party, and I've joined the Green Party hopefully to be involved in a really exciting movement that is aiming to change Britain, to make hope normal again, and to really improve the lives of ordinary people in this country.
That's really interesting. I'm going to come back to that hope point shortly, but let's start with the Greens. What is it specifically about the party that has attracted you to it? Is it the leadership of Zach Polanski? Has there been a change in the Green Party that you've seen, or is it the policies that they have? What is it?
Well, I've always worked collaboratively with the Green Party. When I stood in 2017, the Green Party stood down and hundreds of their activists were outdoor knocking for me day in, day out. I've always believed in coalitions and progressive alliances where we need them and where we can have them. So it's not like I'm joining a party that I don't know. I feel like I know them. But what we see with the leadership of Zach is a clear articulation of how we make those messages popular. He talks about it, kind of eco-populism and things like this. And I think that's so important. For me, the two key things of a decent political party is that you are populist, i.e. you understand the needs and wants and desires of ordinary people, and you translate difficult and complex situations into simple messages that they can be inspired by. And secondly, it is to be broad-based, not to be a particular ideological sect, but to have a broad base of views that you accept and you are willing to work with, and you are willing to listen to different views within your party. And to me, the Green Party at the moment is not only the only game in town, it's an exemplar in those two things.
Yeah, I think his analysis is right? So you need to have a message that's going to resonate with people, but that message needs to be based upon a broad voter coalition. And if you're going to have a broad voter coalition, it needs to be based upon having a broad tent political party. So this is one of the key failings of the Starmer leadership, that he was so hostile to the left that he ended up being hostile to his own voter base. People on the left in politics, progressive activists is what the pollsters called them, are the Labour Party's most loyal supporters, and they've drifted away from the party because they've been pushed out. So what you need to be able to do as a viable political project is create a voter coalition that encompasses both your core support, which for the Green Party is going to be on the left, but also a broader coalition of voters that are going to get behind the party, perhaps with different ideological priorities. I don't quite know what that looks like for the Green Party. They seem to be presently able to win constituencies both in places like Brighton and in rural constituencies. But I think that creates tensions within the party, so it's not clear to me quite what their coalition looks like. But I voted for Zach to be leader because my fundamental sense was that there was an opportunity in British politics for the failure of the establishment to be exploited on the left. And so far, the evidence is that it's going really well for the Green Party. They're up to about 15% in the polls, I would say. Depends which polls you look at, but the polling average is around 15%. It started at 9% when Zach Polanski took over as leader, and the Green Party membership has, correct me if I'm wrong, roughly doubled. This is a party really on the up and really exploiting the opportunity created by the Labour Party. So you could criticise Lloyd as being opportunistic, but look, I would say to that, all politicians are a little bit self-interested. He's clearly seen an opportunity, and I don't think we should criticise him for that. The fact is that Lloyd was such a fantastic local MP when he was a Member of Parliament. He's got loads of support, so the Green Party would be mad not to back him. And what he could have done, rather than moving to the Green Party, is stand as an independent. That would have been far, far worse in our local context, because that would have divided the left locally. So it's much better that he could be convinced to join the Green Party and hopefully run as our candidate than to split the left locally.
I think I appreciate the comment about the broad base, but I think one of the sort of the sticklers of that will be their policies on wealth tax and their policies on immigration. So can I just start with the wealth tax? Is that something that you would support, and is that something that you're disappointed that perhaps the Labour Party hasn't invested in?
I've always supported a form of wealth tax. We have a very poor form of wealth tax in council tax, basically, in property at the moment, but it is completely broken and doesn't work for anyone. And there was an opportunity when this new government came in to really rethink that. And they have completely dropped the ball on it. And so the idea of a wealth tax, where we say the hoarding of money is not an acceptable thing in a modern society. You might remember that Emma Barnett on Radio 5 during the 2019 election scolded me for saying that I didn't think billionaires should exist in this country. And I think it was the day of the election launch, and I got lots of ticking off for diverting from the official Labour Party message. But I still stand by that. I don't think that we should be having people in this country that are hoarding wealth from others and are not sharing it and are not using it for social good. And that's what wealth tax encourages. That's what wealth tax pushes for, a country that uses its resources for everyone to benefit and everyone to rise rather than a few.
Absolutely right. If you've got private hoarding of wealth, then it means the rest of us have to languish in public squalor. I won't rehearse those arguments because I talked about them earlier. What is the ceiling for the Green Party's support? It's an interesting question. I guess I think that it's about 40% of the vote, really, because if you think about it, that's historically what progressive parties in British politics have been able to achieve. The Green strategy relies upon and must rely upon destroying the Labour Party and replacing them. And I think that is possible because they're starting to get into a position where they might be moving into second place. And I think I said this ages ago, by the way, so check out the video I made ages ago on this, because I said this long before they were in this position of strength. As soon as the Green Party move into second place, it becomes existential for Labour, because the Labour Party don't have a base of support in the country. What they have is an argument that says we're technocratically the best party to lead the country, and it's either us or reform. And I think the first argument is not really what people are looking for. They're looking for an ideological divide, not a technocratic divide. And the second argument doesn't fly if the Green Party are second in the polls. I think the Labour Party's case for being the next government really falls apart if the Green Party can achieve what I think they're about to achieve, which is to replace the Labour Party as the second biggest party in polling in the country. And they really need to worry quite quickly about this and replace Keir Starmer as leader, not with West Streeting, but with somebody sensible from the left. I'm also in favour of a one-off wealth tax, just responding to the chat, and that's because wealth taxes are going to lead to avoidance behaviour. And so it'd be much better to have a one-off tax that would be difficult to avoid and to make it a big amount of money. So perhaps you tax, everybody above 5 million, 5%, or whatever you happen to think the right level is, and then you get a big amount of money in. But remember, the purpose of the tax is not to raise revenue. The purpose of the tax is to deal with inequality. So it might be better to have a broader range of wealth taxes that deal with that question than thinking that what you're really trying to achieve is to raise revenue. Oh, okay.
Looking at the recent announcement this week from Labour on new immigration rules, particularly around bringing in this Danish system, you're going to have refugees who are on 20 years, visas before they're allowed to have settled status. Is that a push factor for you away from the Labour Party? And do you think that's something that you could change by being within the Greens?
Well, it definitely is one of those final straws. The idea that in that announcement that they said that they would look at taking jewellery and personal effects off refugees as they came over on that crossing. Now, no one wants people on that crossing, but to snatch people's jewellery is just, I think, one of the most revolting things that you can suggest. Why would you do that? That is not a deterrent. That is just cruelty. That is just nastiness. And it's something that even the Conservatives in their very worst days would have never contemplated. The idea that we're going to remove ourselves from sections of the human rights regulations and regime because we want to be able to ensure people don't have the right to a family life is just abhorrent to how you think children could be engaged with being deported. The idea that the government hasn't been able to discuss whether they would tear families apart or not in this plan. I think all of it is absolutely unpleasant. But the worst part of it is that I don't think it will deter a single person. It will stop people integrating because they won't be here permanently. It will stop people accessing services because they won't be eligible for many services. But what it will not do is stop people coming over here who are desperate and who are keen. The only way we stop people coming to the UK is to have a proper, fair and legal routes to apply for asylum outside of the UK. Something that is still impossible, something that NGOs and campaigners have been asking for time and time again, something that even the mayor of Calais has said that they would be willing to think about now, proper processing centres in France, in other places around the world. And actually, if you are going to say we should follow the most miserable processes of asylum around the world, like the Australian model, that actually worked because they had proper, fair and legal routes in other countries that people could apply for. What we're doing is closing our border, denigrating asylum seekers and refugees, and also not providing fair, legal routes to this country. It is just wrong and abhorrent. And the reason that refugee convention was introduced in this country was nothing to do with how other people were treating refugees and asylum seekers. The reason we introduced that refugee convention was because we were so embarrassed in this country that we had turned away Jews fleeing the Nazis. And the idea now that we forget that historical message and turn our back on some of the conventions that we had helped build makes me definitely wonder about the compassion in this country and in the Labour Party.
You can see why people were annoyed locally at Lloyd being deselected at the last election. He's incredibly articulate, he's thoughtful. You might not agree with him, and I think a lot of his constituents didn't necessarily agree with everything he said. But he's a really good local MP that said what he thought, and I really liked him because he's on the left. But he was always on the soft left, was Lloyd. I mean, he's not a radical. He toed the party line as much as he could whilst he was a member of the Labour Party. He was constrained. I hope for Lloyd's sake that actually, with him joining the Green Party, it might release some of those constraints, and he might be able to actually say a little bit more of what he thinks. Because he's really articulate and really good at making a political argument. So I really hope that the Green Party select him for this seat at the next election, because it's a winnable seat, and the person we've got, Chris Ward, is terrible. A right-wing ghoul who is part of the plot against Corbyn, is a fully fledged signed-up Starmerite. Just responding to the chat, Andy Burnham. I've got a lot of time for Andy Burnham, but I've been burned before, and so I'm open to people who say to me, "What the hell would you know? You backed Keir Starmer to be leader," which I did. So look, I wouldn't listen to me about Andy Burnham in terms of whether he'll be, whether he'll remain committed to his principles, or whether his stance is, a confected stance to win the leadership. I don't know, and I don't trust my own judgment. Do I think that somebody like Burnham, with his level of political skill, if he remained committed to a radical platform, do I think he could turn things around? Well, maybe. It's the Labour Party's only hope. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But it needs to be either Labour or the Green Party under Zach Polansky. And I think my preference at the moment is that the Labour Party die and that the Green Party take over the job of opposing Farage.
But then the only party I see turning that around, the only party that I see speaking out against it, the only party that is calling this as it is morally wrong, to me seems to be the Green Party, under the leadership of Zach, but actually under the support of hundreds of thousands of new members that have joined, because they also see that what this government is doing is wrong.
Can I talk to you a little bit about housing? I mean, around Brighton, there is a huge issue with housing. I spoke to a student who's actually living on this very campus that we're on. She's paying £200 a week to live here. And, there's an argument here that it's because there simply isn't enough proper housing in Brighton in order for them to move out. What would you want to see the Green Party do on housing? What would attract you, or what has attracted you on those?
This is a really soft question for Lloyd because he's really interested in housing. He used to sit on the Public Bill Committee that was looking at the Renters Reform Bill under the Tories, so he knows a lot about this.
Policies.
Well, a real understanding that it is not just a policy of build, baby, build, which is what some people are pushing forward, but it's a policy of the right kind of tenure in the right kind of place that has local community buy-in. It is making sure that we have decent council housing. It is making sure that we have rent regulation. It is making sure that we have rights for renters. And those are the kinds of policies that the Green Party are putting forward. And those are the kinds of policies, in my view, that will make a difference to the ordinary renter in this country. I sat on the Renters' Rights Bill where in the last Parliament when we were...
It's making me look really nerdy that I know that. I just happened to... I was a teacher in Brighton and we had Lloyd in and he talked about this in front of my students. That's the only reason I know that.
Trying to bring it through, and I constantly tried to put forward amendments for proper rental regulation. I constantly tried to put forward amendments for even possibly the right to buy in the rented sector, i.e. if you had rented a house for a long time, why couldn't you buy it from the landlord? And they were always rejected, not by the Conservatives, but it was Labour that was saying, no, you can't push that, Lloyd, that's too far, that's too radical. And actually the Green Party, I think, are willing to listen to those ideas that would actually alleviate the real crisis that we have in housing in this country.
Do you have a little bit of reticence then, if you have been pushed back on before with more radical reforms? If you look at Adrian Ramsey, for example, who was the former co-leader of the Green Party, he had turned down an application or fought against an application for pylons for renewable energy in his constituency. You've also got Rachel Millward, well, actually around here in Sussex, who has just declined accommodation for 600 asylum seekers. Does that worry you? Is there a sense of NIMBYism perhaps in the group?
I don't know what this story is about. I need to look into this. But isn't the objection to this that they were going to be housed in a military base? I seem to remember that that's what was proposed. Very different to be objecting to it on that basis than to just object to it full stop. But I don't know the details of this one. I'm going to have to look into it.
Green Party that you're going to have to work on?
Well, look, the role of democracy in this country is that you represent your local area first and your ideology second. Okay? I mean, the Labour MP for Calderdale in West Yorkshire is opposing a wind farm expansion up there, even though the government is backing it. That is quite right. It is quite right that local representatives, whatever party they are from, Green, Labour, wherever, that they represent their local people first. And the problem with a lot of the build, baby, build rhetoric is it's top-down, heavy-handed. What we actually need is proper community solutions where you bring communities together. I
love that from Lloyd, that this sort of benign idea that democracy is where you need to place your trust, and that if you do put your trust in communities and local people and workers within their organisations, that they'll make good decisions because they'll have ownership and autonomy and control over those decisions. You've got to trust in democracy within a democratic society.
My view, personally, is that I am less sympathetic to people that complain about pylons, because I think that ordinary working people have had factories and unpleasant roads built next to their houses for generations, and now it's being built, a pylon is being put next to a middle-class house, they're all up in arms. I have less sympathy for that. But it is quite right, in a broad-based party, that a member of parliament or an elected representative can reflect that maybe there is a better way of doing this that could...
He's just a quality politician, right? I mean, this is why I like Lloyd. Like, I don't always agree with him, but like, you don't get bullshit from him, and you don't just get ideological answers. You get difficult answers and nuanced answers, and he answers the questions directly. And there's principle behind it. Like, fundamentally, what Lloyd is saying here is, I believe in democracy. And I believe in the idea of members of parliament representing their communities. And that leads to these implications that I agree with. You know, it's what we're missing in politics, people like Lloyd, which is why it was so painful to me. It really was painful. I was sitting in a pub just about to start the pub quiz in Lloyd's constituency when I got a text from somebody saying, the Labour Party have just come after Lloyd, and there was an emergency protest within the constituency, and I literally downed my pint and ran over to where the protest was and joined people there. And we immediately advocated for Lloyd to run as an independent, and he might have done okay, you know. But Lloyd wasn't up for it, and his loyalty to the Labour Party survived even that horrendous thing that happened to him. Fundamentally, Lloyd wanted a Labour government, and I don't blame him for that. He remained loyal to the Labour Party for longer than I ever would. But what you get from him is clarity of expression, clear values, and nuance, and that's what we need in a representative. And the other thing you get from him is responses to your emails.
Bring all people together. And in fact, one of the worst things you can do in politics is to ignore what people are saying on the ground and to say, no, we know right how to do this. We're just going to push forward on it. And that's why I'm pleased about that change in the Green Party, actually, that it is about listening to people, that populism that Zach talks about. That means that you have to listen to people's real concerns. And that might be a camp being set up without the right infrastructure. And the question should not be, how do we not have that? The question should be, how do we provide the right resources and infrastructure to get the community on board? When I went and visited the Bivvy Stockholm, which was the refugee barge down in Portland, a lot of the local residents were telling me they weren't actually opposed to having a barge there. What they were opposed to is there being no community benefit. Their local hospital had recently shut down, and the government was paying for private doctors to go into the barge. Why on earth wasn't there a win-win situation there where we reopened the hospital, we're using some of the money that needed for healthcare for the refugees and some of the support for the local community? You can have win-win solutions, and it's quite right that people oppose heavy-handed top-down solutions when they are not going to work.
Yeah, there's the sort of zero-sum game, isn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And and you see that all over the place. So I have no problem with individuals raising these concerns.
Well, this is a good segue actually into Labour then. Do you think there's been a sense over the past year and a bit while Labour have been in government that they haven't been listening to local voters, to local constituency MPs? Is there a sense that perhaps they are ploughing on with legislation that doesn't match what the mandate was?
I'm afraid they haven't been listening to anyone. And how they treat their own party members, I mean, my treatment was egregious, but only 2 months ago, the local secretary of my Labour branch was kicked out for attending a trans rights protest. Last week, the local media officer in Brighton was kicked out of the Labour Party because he wrote an obituary for an old socialist that wasn't approved by the Labour Party. It is authoritarian. It's rather nasty. And you now see those kinds of attitudes in government.
I attended the trans rights protest. If it's the same one that Lloyd is referencing, we have a very strong trans pride in Brighton. That's very political and represents the community really well and people's concerns. So the idea that somebody was kicked out of the Labour Party for attending that, if that's what he's talking about, is ridiculous.
From this party, you see where decent citizens want to raise their voice around a genocide in Palestine, rather than the government confronting the issue, rather than the government actually saying that they would take action like the Spanish government has done. Instead, they make supporting Palestine action a terrorist crime. Absolutely disproportionate.
Obviously, this appeals to me. People probably don't know this because they wouldn't have lasted this long, but I talked about this earlier. I was arrested for holding up a sign on a protest. Lloyd used to be my Member of Parliament, and I could have gone to him and had this level of support. Instead, I've got Chris Ward, parachuted in, Labour right, sent him an email about exactly this, and he hasn't responded. So this is the choice that we face in my constituency.
Absolutely disgraceful, but absolutely authoritarian. And it's what they have been doing, and they continue to do. And you see that with other areas where people, the disability changes, for example, stopped. Not completely, but in a large part because of a backbench rebellion. But then the punishment of Labour people who supported that rebellion and who said it was wrong. It's not a listening government. And the people around, I'm afraid, are not pleasant people. Now, that shouldn't determine the final bit of politics. The final bit of politics should be on policy, not on personality. But if you have people that are personally horrible, that, I'm afraid, outlines into their politics, and their politics is one of unpleasantness.
Well, I think let's talk a little bit about your deselection just before the election, because it did come as a surprise. It was the precipitator to Faiza Shaheen's
I mean, it did come as a surprise, but I think those of us in the local community, we were kind of thinking, when are they going to come after Lloyd? Because he tried so hard to get the balance right between being socialist but also towing the party line, that actually he's going to face a bit of criticism from people on the left, because there's lots of clips floating around of him where he tries to do that balance as a Labour MP. My view is it doesn't fully represent his politics, because he was trying so hard to not piss off the Labour right and get deselected. But then it happened to him anyway. You know, he thought he was getting the balance. He thought he was Clive Lewis, right? That getting the balance right, being just critical enough, but just about remaining within the fold. But he would have lost the whip after the election, because he'd have voted against. He'd have voted against various changes that they made, like the benefits changes that they made. So it wouldn't have lasted. But I think for many of us, we were thinking, when's it going to happen? And the reality is, Chris Ward wanted the seat. He'd wanted to stand specifically in this seat, and my view is, and it's just what I think, that people unearthed an 8 years old allegation, put it into the public domain because they wanted Chris Ward to be parachuted in, and that's what happened.
Selection in your constituency, Chris Ward was awarded that selection, awarded the ballot, and he is a former Keir Starmer staffer. Can we delve into a little bit? Because I think
it's worse than that. He was actively undermining the Labour leadership under Jeremy Corbyn, and was part of the most nefarious, undemocratic. It was a coup against the British public that was orchestrated by the Labour right when they took over the Labour Party under false pretences, put this guy in power, Keir Starmer, who had conspired against the leadership of his party, against the members of the Labour Party to get elected, and then went against everything that he said he would do to become leader, and then went on to do the same, really, as Prime Minister.
there will be some questions. What was the reason that was given to you? I know that the investigation is now over, but I'd like to hear your perspective. What was the reason that was given to you of why you could not appear on the ballot at that time?
At the time, they said a complaint had been received, and they gave 3 vague statements on what that complaint was about, all before I was an MP. And I wouldn't tell me who had made it, but it was clear from the 3 allegations that that it was a complaint that had already been submitted to the Labour Party a number of years prior, and already been looked at and been considered to be either vexatious or non-serious. And the party said these were serious matters, and if you look at them, they weren't. And I said that to the party at the time, and I said, well, can I at least put my case? No, the decision's been made. You can't even put your case. You can't even write a letter for us to consider the alternative argument here. We've decided you're not going to be on the ballot paper. All you need.
I guess it was all decided by the National Executive Committee, because this is how the Labour Party was operating at the time, and the NEC was controlled by the Labour right. So, and they wanted their guy in. Like, it was totally unjust, totally wrong. Everybody in the local community understood that, and like, if you knock on doors around here, which I do obviously because I'm an active member of a political party, the Green Party here, so I'm not commenting on this as a neutral person, people will say to you here, I'm really annoyed about what happened to Lloyd. People will volunteer that, and they know the MP's name, the former MP's name, right? Because that's how much it resonated. So this seat that Lloyd hopefully will stand in as the Green Party candidate, it's really winnable. The Green Party were on 20% of the vote last time with a paper candidate, really. The Greens didn't really campaign. This election, very, very winnable. especially with a candidate like Lloyd, it should really be a landslide. It should be a very, very strong result. So I'm very excited about this.
To decide, they said, was how you want to resign. That was all the choice. And I pushed back and I said, well, I want to at least put my case that some of this is just untrue. And I was given 12 hours to respond afterwards. And they said, but the words they used, but it's a Hail Mary, Lloyd, don't expect anything to change. And so I put the case together, and including, during that 12 hours, I found out that the party had twice written to this complainant saying, are you sure you don't want to resubmit the complaint? So they had courted this complaint. Now,
there we go. This is like absolute stitch up.
I'm sure the party will give explanation. Oh, well, we just wanted to make sure everything was clear off the books, etc., etc. But we know, from my perspective, they had received the complaint many years before. They had looked at the complaint and they had dismissed it. And then I see this, and I have a copy of the letter from the party to the individual saying, are you sure, sir, that you don't want to resubmit this case? And I don't know why the decision was done to resubmit it, but clearly the person did.
Oh, come on, Lloyd, you're off the hook now. You don't have to protect these people. Everybody else can guess why. There was a factional attempt to deselect Labour MPs on the left of the party. They went after Diane Abbott, and the only reason she survived is because the whole community of her constituency came out and supported her. That's why, because they wanted to parachute in somebody from the Labour right, a Starmer loyalist, into our community, into your seat.
Months later pass, I'm off the ballot paper, I hear nothing from the party, and then I get a letter from the party saying, you've spoken too much about why you were deselected, we're going to start another disciplinary against you. And I said, well, hang on a second, Keir Starmer's office said that I had to make a statement. They said, you've got to decide the terms you resign. Oh yes, but the rules say you need to have confirmation from the General Secretary to speak about anything, and you didn't get it. You only got confirmation from the leader. So they then gave me a written warning of my conduct. So it's all Kafkaesque. It's all one side tells you to say something, then they get you for doing that. And then in December last year, almost a year ago now, they wrote to me saying, we wrote to the individual asking for more evidence. The individual at that point has withdrawn their complaint against you, and we have no evidence to pursue, so therefore you're back in to the party. Let's forget it's all happened.
But you're not a Labour MP.
No.
And you missed the election.
Exactly.
Can I ask you, what do you...
I mean, how does Lloyd not jump ship before now? That's the thing I can't understand about his position. They treated him appallingly. I mean, it felt at times like people in the constituency were more upset about it than he was, but he remained loyal. And I think he genuinely felt that he might be able to challenge Chris Ward for the nomination for the Labour Party next time around, which obviously the Labour Party would never allow to happen.
What do you think the underlying reason was that? Like, not to potentially conspiracy theory here, but there was a suggestion at one point in time that people who were perhaps more left-leaning were being asked to leave the party. The sort of the Morgan McSweeney campaign directorship meant that a number of quote-unquote socialists were not wanted on the ballot. Do you think you fell into that category?
Well, I was chair for many years of the Socialist Campaign Group in Parliament. I don't hold orthodox socialist views, my hetero-orthodox socialist views. I believe in the collective of ideas, and I believe sometimes you need to take strands from different things. I believe very much in cooperation and cooperatives, which often can, in the Labour Party terms, be more of a centrist view. So I do have multiple different, because I think you can learn from all different views and ideologies, but I am a socialist. And it was clear, wasn't it, that there was a hostility to socialists in the Labour Party, even though they say that they're a democratic socialist party. Now, I don't know whether there was a conspiracy or a list that they went down, but I do know that all of us in that Socialist Campaign Group, from John McDonnell to Olivia Blake, all of us had talked about the fact that we were worried that they were trying to trip us up at any moment and would try and get us off the ballot paper. And we all talked about it in those terms that they could come for any of us at any moment, and there's nothing that we could really do about it, and we just had to try and hope that we scraped through. Most did. I wasn't able to. But it is not a very healthy political culture. You don't get MPs that then are willing to speak out and do the right thing if they're constantly fearful that the party is going to stab them in the back. And I think after a while you realise if you have that unhealthy political culture in your own party, you export that unhealthy political culture into the wider politics when you govern.
Do you think Morgan McSweeney is the danger?
That's a very telling comment. And it's important actually for left-wing parties to understand this. The nature of the party is going to affect what you do politically to the country. So if you have an ultra-democratic party, that's going to result in, an approach to the country that's going to be ultra-democratic. If you've got an authoritarian, technocratic party, that's going to affect how they govern. And we've seen that with the Labour Party. This incredibly authoritarian takeover by the right of the Labour Party has resulted in really quite an authoritarian approach to things like protest in the country, right? So they're treating protesters in exactly the same way as they're treating, as they treat their own members and their own members of Parliament.
Dangerous force in the Labour Party.
He is clearly one of them.
On a lighter note, Green Party, if you've got one policy that you would like to bring to the table to talk to members about, now obviously I would never suggest that you have to implement it tomorrow because that is not the nature of the Green Party, as you said. What would you want to bring to the table to discuss?
I would like us to get serious with a plan that Caroline Lucas and I had hatched when we were both MPs, which is a plan to go street by street, house by house, and offer full insulation, full heat replacement for boilers, and we do it in a coordinated national way that means people pay not one penny. Doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, but because we say this is part of a national endeavour, and it is maybe something that you will pay over time in energy bills, etc. But we need to do every house. It can't be just the free market, and it needs to be coordinated. Just like we did when we changed from town gas to natural gas, we paid for individuals to come into every house because every gas boiler and every cooker had to be changed during that changeover. We didn't say to people, oh, when you're changing, we'll give you a little grant. We organised it. That's the kind of level that we need to take those kinds of social actions. And of course, it helps with mould and damp and the disease that we see in our housing up and down this country at the moment. And it fulfills those climate objectives. And to me, I would love the Greens to be pushing to make that reality. And I don't think that they would be objectionable to that whatsoever.
Eco-populist, I would say, in nature that.
Maybe.
Lloyd Russell, thank you very much.
So there we go. So there's Lloyd Russell Moyle. He's going to have a press conference tomorrow in Brighton, which I'll be at. And I'm going to take my. I bought a new microphone. Here it is. I'm going to take this along and I'm going to try and interview him. So there might be a video coming out where I talk to him in person about moving to the Green Party. That might be coming out. But there we go. I'm going to leave it there because I've had far too much wine on this stream. I don't normally drink when I'm doing these things, but I just fancied. I've drank a whole bottle. That's the reality. That is how much is left of a bottle, and it's not going to survive me leaving the stream. So yeah, thanks for joining me this evening. It's been nice to have you with me. I hope you survived question time. It's always a bit trying. I didn't think it was a particularly good one. Anyway, see you soon. Cheerio. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe, although I imagine most of you are.